Part 3, Chapter 4 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 4. Léon soon put on an air of superiority before his comrades, avoided their company, and completely neglected his work. He waited for her letters. He reread them. He wrote to her. He called it to mind with all the strength of his desires and of his memories. Instead of lessening with absence, this longing to see her again grew, so that at last on Saturday morning he escaped from his office. When from the summit of the hill he saw in the valley below the church spire with its tin flag swinging in the wind, he felt that delight mingled with triumphant vanity and egoistic tenderness that millionaires must experience when they come back to their native village. He went rambling round her house. A light was burning in the kitchen. He watched for her shadow behind the curtains, but nothing appeared. Mère Lefrançois, when she saw him, uttered many exclamations. She thought he had grown and was thinner, while Artémise, on the contrary, thought him stouter and darker. He dined in the little room as of yore, but alone, without the tax-gatherer, for Binet, tired of waiting for the Hirondelle, had definitely put forward his meal 1 hour, and now he dined punctually at 5, and yet he declared usually the rickety old concern was late. Léon, however, made up his mind and knocked at the doctor's door. Madame was in her room and did not come down for a quarter of an hour. The doctor seemed delighted to see him, but he never stirred out that evening, nor all the next day. He saw her alone in the evening, very late, behind the garden in the lane. In the lane as she had the other one. It was a stormy night, and they talked under an umbrella by lightning flashes. Their separation was becoming intolerable. "I would rather die," said Emma. She was writhing in his arms, weeping. "Adieu, adieu, when shall I see you again?" They came back again to embrace once more, and it was then that she promised him to find soon, by no matter what means, a regular opportunity for seeing one another in freedom at least once a week. Emma never doubted she should be able to do this. Besides, she was full of hope. Some money was coming to her. On the strength of it she bought a pair of yellow curtains with large stripes for her room, whose cheapness Monsieur Lheureux had commended. She dreamt of getting a carpet, and Lheureux, declaring that it wasn't drinking the sea, politely undertook to supply her with one. She could no longer do without his services. 20 times a day she sent for him, and he at once put by his business without a murmur. People could not understand either why Mère Rollet breakfasted with her every day, and even paid her private visits. It was about this time, that is to say, the beginning of winter, that she seemed seized with great musical fervour. One evening, when Charles was listening to her, she began the same piece 4 times over, each time with much vexation, while he, not noticing any difference, cried, "Bravo! Very good! You are wrong to stop. Go on." "Oh, no, it is execrable. My fingers are quite rusty." The next day he begged her to play him something again. "Very well, to please you." And Charles confessed she had gone off a little. She played wrong notes and blundered, then, stopping short, "Ah, 'tis no use. I ought to take some lessons, but—" She bit her lips and added, 20 francs a lesson, that is too dear." "Yes, so it is, rather," said Charles, giggling stupidly. "But it seems to me that one might be able to do it for less, for there are artists of no reputation, and who are often better than the celebrities." "Find them," said Emma. The next day when he came home he looked at her shyly, and at last could no longer keep back the words. "How obstinate you are sometimes! I went to Barfouchere today. Well, Madame Ligard assured me that her 3 young ladies who are at La Miséricorde have lessons at 50 sous apiece, and that from an excellent mistress." She shrugged her shoulders and did not open her piano again. But when she passed by it, if Bovary were there, she sighed, "Ah, my poor piano." and when anyone came to see her, she did not fail to inform them that she had given up music and could not begin again now for important reasons. Then people commiserated her. What a pity! She had so much talent. They even spoke to Bovary about it. They put him to shame, and especially the chemist. "You are wrong. One should never let any of the faculties of nature lie fallow. Besides, just think, my good friend, that by inducing Madame to study, you are economizing on the subsequent musical education of your child. For my own part, I think that mothers ought themselves to instruct their children. That is an idea of Rousseau's, still rather new perhaps, but that will end by triumphing, I am certain of it, like mothers nursing their own children and vaccination." So Charles returned once more to this question of the piano. Emma replied bitterly that it would be better to sell it. This poor piano that had given her vanity so much satisfaction, to see it go was to Bovary like the indefinable suicide of a part of herself. "If you liked," he said, "a lesson from time to time, that wouldn't after all be very ruinous." "But lessons," she replied, "are only of use when followed up." And thus it was she set about obtaining her husband's permission to go to town once a week to see her lover. At the end of a month she was even considered to have made considerable progress. End of Part 3, Chapter 4. Part 3, Chapter 5 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 5. She went on Thursdays. She got up and dressed silently in order not to awaken Charles, who would have made remarks about her getting ready too early. Next she walked up and down, went to the windows, and looked out at the Place. The early dawn was broadening between the pillars of the market, and the chemist's shop, with the shutters still up, showed in the pale light of the dawn the large letters of his signboard. When the clock pointed to 7:15, she went off to the lion door, whose door Artemise opened yawning. The girl then made up the coals covered by the cinders, and Emma remained alone in the kitchen. Now and again she went out. Yver was leisurely harnessing his horses, listening moreover to Mère Lefrançois, who, passing her head and nightcap through a grating, was charging him with commissions and giving him explanations that would have confused anyone else. Emma kept beating the soles of her boots against the pavement of the yard. At last, when he had eaten his soup, put on his cloak, lighted his pipe, and grasped his whip, he calmly installed himself on his seat. The Hirondelle started at a slow trot, and for about a mile stopped here and there to pick up passengers who waited for it, standing at the border of the road in front of their yard gates. Those who had secured seats the evening before kept it waiting. Some even were still in bed in their houses. Yver called, shouted, swore. Then he got down from his seat and went and knocked loudly at the doors. The wind blew through the cracked windows. The 4 seats, however, filled up. The carriage rolled off. Rows of apple trees followed one upon another, and the road between its 2 long ditches full of yellow water rose, constantly narrowing towards the horizon. Emma knew it from end to end. She knew that after a meadow there was a signpost, next an elm, a barn, or the hut of a lime-kiln tender. Sometimes even, in the hope of getting some surprise, she shut her eyes, but she never lost the clear perception of the distance to be traversed. At last the brick houses began to follow one another more closely. The earth resounded beneath the wheels. The Hirondelle glided between the gardens, where through an opening one saw statues, a periwinkle plant, clipped yews, and a swing. Then on a sudden the town appeared. Sloping down like an amphitheatre and drowned in the fog, it widened out beyond the bridges confusedly. Then the open country spread away with a monotonous movement till it touched in the distance the vague line of the pale sky. Seen thus from above, the whole landscape looked immovable as a picture. The anchored ships were massed in one corner, the river curved round the foot of the green hills, and the isles, oblique in shape, lay on the water like large, motionless black fishes. The factory chimneys belched forth immense brown fumes that were blown away at the top. One heard the rumbling of the foundries, together with the clear chimes of the churches that stood out in the mist. The leafless trees on the boulevards made violet thickets in the midst of the houses, and the roofs, all shining with the rain, threw back unequal reflections according to the height of the quarters in which they were. Sometimes a gust of wind drove the clouds towards the St. Catherine hills, like aerial waves that broke silently against a cliff. A giddiness seemed to her to detach itself from this mass of existence, and her heart swelled as if the 120,000 souls that palpitated there had all at once sent into it the vapour of the passions she fancied theirs. Her love grew in the presence of this vastness, and expanded with tumult to the vague murmurings that rose towards her. She poured it out upon the square, on the walks, on the streets, and the old Norman city outspread before her eyes as an enormous capital, as a Babylon into which she was entering. She leant with both hands against the window, drinking in the breeze. The 3 horses galloped, the stones grated in the mud, the diligence rocked, and Hiver from afar hailed the carts on the road, while the bourgeois who had spent the night at the Guillaume woods came quietly down the hill in their little family carriages. They stopped at the barrier. Emma undid her overshoes, put on other gloves, rearranged her shawl, and some 20 paces farther she got down from the Hirondelle. The town was then awakening. Shop boys in caps were cleaning up the shop fronts, and women with baskets against their hips at intervals uttered sonorous cries at the corners of streets. She walked with downcast eyes close to the walls, and smiling with pleasure under her lowered black veil. For fear of being seen, she did not usually take the most direct road. She plunged into dark alleys, and, all perspiring, reached the bottom of the Rue Nationale near the fountain that stands there. It is the quarter for theatres, public-houses, and whores. Often a cart would pass near her, bearing some shaking scenery. Waiters in aprons were sprinkling sand on the flagstones between green shrubs. It all smelt of absinthe, cigars, and oysters. She turned down a street. She recognized him by his curling hair that escaped from beneath his hat. Léon walked along the pavement. She followed him to the hotel. He went up, opened the door, entered. What an embrace! Then, after the kisses, the words gushed forth. They told each other the sorrows of the week, the presentiments, the anxiety for the letters, but now everything was forgotten. They gazed into each other's faces with voluptuous laughs and tender names. The bed was large, of mahogany, in the shape of a boat. The curtains were in red levantine that hung from the ceiling and bulged out too much towards the bell-shaped bedside, and nothing in the world was so lovely as her brown head and white skin standing out against this purple colour when, with a movement of shame, she crossed her bare arms, hiding her face in her hands. The warm room, with its discreet carpet, its gay ornaments, and its calm light, seemed made for the intimacies of passion. The curtain rods, ending in arrows, their brass pegs, and the great balls of the fire-dogs shone suddenly when the sun came in. On the chimney between the candelabra there were 2 of those pink shells in which one hears the murmur of the sea if one holds them to the ear. How they loved that dear room, so full of gaiety, despite its rather faded splendour. They always found the furniture in the same place, and sometimes hairpins that she had forgotten the Thursday before under the pedestal of the clock. They lunched by the fireside on a little round table, inlaid with rosewood. Emma carved, put bits on his plate with all sorts of coquettish ways, and she laughed with a sonorous and libertine laugh when the froth of the champagne ran over from the glass to the rings on her fingers. They were so completely lost in the possession of each other that they thought themselves in their own house, and that they would live there till death, like 2 spouses eternally young. They said, "Our room, our carpet." She even said, "My slippers," a gift of Léon's, a whim she had had. They were pink satin bordered with swansdown. When she sat on his knees, Her leg, then too short, hung in the air, and the dainty shoe that had no back to it was held only by the toes of her bare foot. He, for the first time, enjoyed the inexpressible delicacy of feminine refinement. He had never met this grace of language, this reserve of clothing, these poses of the weary dove. He admired the exaltation of her soul and the lace of her petticoat. Besides, was she not a lady and a married woman, a real mistress, in fine? By the diversity of her humour, in turn mystical or mirthful, talkative, taciturn, passionate, careless, she awakened in him 1,000 desires, called up instincts or memories. She was the mistress of all the novels, the heroine of all the dramas, the vague she of all the volumes of verse. He found again on her shoulders the amber colouring of the odalisque bathing. She had the long waist of feudal chatelaines, and she resembled the pale woman of Barcelona. But above all, she was the angel. Often looking at her, it seemed to him that his soul, escaping towards her, spread like a wave about the outline of her head and descended drawn down into the whiteness of her breast. He knelt on the ground before her, and with both elbows on her knees looked at her with a smile, his face upturned. She bent over him and murmured, as if choking with intoxication, "Oh, do not move, do not speak, look at me. Something so sweet comes from your eyes that helps me so much." She called him child. "Child, do you love me?" And she did not listen for his answer in the haste of her lips that fastened to his mouth. On the clock there was a bronze Cupid, who smirked as he bent his arm beneath a golden garland. They had laughed at it many a time, but when they had to part, everything seemed serious to them. Motionless in front of each other, they kept repeating, "Till Thursday, till Thursday." Suddenly she seized his head between her hands, kissed him hurriedly on the forehead, crying "Adieu," and rushed down the stairs. She went to a hairdresser's in the Rue de la Comédie to have her hair arranged. Night fell. The gas was lighted in the shop. She heard the bell at the theatre calling the mummers to the performance, and she saw, passing opposite, men with white faces and women in faded gowns going in at the stage door. It was hot in the room, small and too low, where the stove was hissing in the midst of wigs and pomades. The smell of the tongs, together with the greasy hands that handled her head, soon stunned her, and she dozed a little in her wrapper. Often, as he did her hair, the man offered her tickets for a masked ball. Then she went away. She went up the streets, reached the Croix Rouge, put on her overshoes that she had hidden in the morning under the seat, and sank into her place among the impatient passengers. Some got out at the foot of the hill. She remained alone in the carriage. At every turning all the lights of the town were seen more and more completely, making a great luminous vapour about the dim houses. Emma knelt on the cushions, and her eyes wandered over the dazzling light. She sobbed, called on Léon, sent him tender words and kisses lost in the wind. On the hillside a poor devil wandered about with his stick in the midst of the diligences. A mass of rags covered his shoulders, and an old staved-in beaver, turned out like a basin, hid his face. But when he took it off, he discovered in the place of eyelids empty and bloody orbits. The flesh hung in red shreds, and there flowed from it liquids that congealed into green scale down to the nose, whose black nostrils sniffed convulsively. To speak to you, he threw back his head with an idiotic laugh, then his bluish eyeballs, rolling constantly, at the temples beat against the edge of the open wound. He sang a little song as he followed the carriages. Maids in the warmth of a summer day dream of love and of love always. And all the rest was about birds and sunshine and green leaves. Sometimes he appeared suddenly behind Emma, bareheaded, and she drew back with a cry. Yvette made fun of him. He would advise him to get a booth at the Saint-Romain fair, or else ask him, laughing, how his young woman was. Often they had started when, with a sudden movement, his hat entered the diligence through the small window, while he clung with his other arm to the footboard, between the wheels splashing mud. His voice, feeble at first and quavering, grew sharp. It resounded in the night like the indistinct moan of a vague distress, and through the ringing of the bells, the murmur of the trees, and the rumbling of the empty vehicle, it had a far-off sound that disturbed Emma. It went to the bottom of her soul, like a whirlwind in an abyss, and carried her away into the distances of a boundless melancholy. But Hivert, noticing a weight behind, gave the blind man shape cuts with his whip. The thong lashed his wounds, and he fell back into the mud with a yell. Then the passengers in the Hirondelle ended by falling asleep, some with open mouths, others with lowered chins, leaning against their neighbour's shoulder, or with their arm passed through the strap, oscillating regularly with the jolting of the carriage, and the reflection of the lantern swinging without on the crupper of the wheeler, penetrating into the interior through the chocolate calico curtains, threw sanguineous shadows over all these motionless people. Emma, drunk with grief, shivered in her clothes, feeling her feet grow colder and colder, and death in her soul. Charles at home was waiting for her. The Hirondelle was always late on Thursdays. Madame arrived at last and scarcely kissed the child. The dinner was not ready. No matter. She excused the servant. This girl now seemed allowed to do just as she liked. Often her husband, noting her pallor, asked if she were unwell. "No," said Emma. "But," he replied, "you seem so strange this evening." "Oh, it's nothing, nothing." There were even days when she had no sooner come in than she went up to her room, and Justin, happening to be there, moved about noiselessly, quicker at helping her than the best of maids. He put the matches ready, the candlestick, a book, arranged her nightgown, turned back the bedclothes. "Come," she said, "that will do. Now you can go." For he stood there, his hands hanging down and his eyes wide open, as if enmeshed in the innumerable threads of a sudden reverie. The following day was frightful, and those that came after still more unbearable, because of her impatience to once again seize her happiness, an ardent lust inflamed by the images of past experience, and that burst forth freely on the seventh day beneath Léon's caresses. His ardours were hidden beneath outbursts of wonder and gratitude. Emma tasted this love in a discreet, absorbed fashion, maintained it by all the artifices of her tenderness, and trembled a little lest it should be lost later on. She often said to him with her sweet, melancholy voice, "Ah, you too, you will leave me. You will marry. You will be like all the others." He asked, "What others?" "Why, like all men," she replied. Then added, repulsing him with a languid movement, "You are all evil." One day, as they were talking philosophically of earthly disillusions, to experiment on his jealousy, or yielding perhaps to an overstrong need to pour out her heart, she told him that formerly, before him, she had loved someone. "Not like you," she went on quickly, protesting by the head of her child that nothing had passed between them. The young man believed her, but none the less questioned her to find out what he was. "He was a ship's captain, my dear." Was this not preventing any inquiry, and at the same time assuming a higher ground through this pretended fascination, exercised over a man who must have been of warlike nature and accustomed to receive homage? The clerk then felt the lowliness of his position. He longed for epaulets, crosses, titles, all that would please her. He gathered that from her spendthrift habits. Emma nevertheless concealed many of these extravagant fancies, such as her wish to have a blue tilbury to drive into Rouen, drawn by an English horse and driven by a groom in top boots. It was Justin who had inspired her with this whim by begging her to take him into her service as valet de chambre, and if the privation of it did not lessen the pleasure of her arrival at each rendezvous, it certainly augmented the bitterness of the return. Often when they talked together of Paris, She ended by murmuring, "Oh, how happy we should be there." "Are we not happy?" gently answered the young man, passing his hands over her hair. "Yes, that is true," she said. "I'm mad. Kiss me." To her husband she was more charming than ever. She made him pistachio creams and played him waltzes after dinner. So he thought himself the most fortunate of men, and Emma was without uneasiness when, one evening, suddenly, he said, "It is Mademoiselle l'Empereur, isn't it, who gives you lessons?" "Yes." "Well, I saw her just now," Charles went on, "at Madame Liard's. I spoke to her about you, and she doesn't know you." This was like a thunderclap. However, she replied quite naturally, "Ah, no doubt she forgot my name." "But perhaps," said the doctor, "there are several Demoiselles l'Empereur at Rouen who are music mistresses." "Possibly." Then quickly, "But I have my receipts here. See?" And she went to the writing table, ransacked all the drawers, rummaged the papers, and at last lost her head so completely that Charles earnestly begged her not to take so much trouble about those wretched receipts. "Oh, find them," she said. And in fact, on the following Friday, as Charles was putting on one of his boots in the dark cabinet where his clothes were kept, he felt a piece of paper between the leather and his sock. He took it out and read, "Received for 3 months' lessons and several pieces of music, the sum of 63 francs. Félicie l'Empereur, professor of music." "How the devil did it get into my boots?" "It must," she replied, "have fallen from the old box of bills that is on the edge of the shelf." From that moment her existence was but one long tissue of lies in which she enveloped her love as in veils to hide it. It was a want, a mania, a pleasure carried to such an extent that if she said she had the day before walked on the right side of the road, one might know she had taken the left. One morning when she had gone, as usual, rather lightly clothed, it suddenly began to snow, and as Charles was watching the weather from the window, he caught sight of Monsieur Bournisien in the chaise of Monsieur Tuvache, who was driving him to Rouen. Then he went down to give the priest a thick shawl that he was to hand over to Emma as soon as he reached the Croix Rouge. When he got to the inn, Monsieur Bournisien asked for the wife of the Yonville doctor. The landlady replied that she very rarely came to her establishment. So that evening, when he recognized Madame Bovary in the Hirondelle, the curé told her his dilemma, without, however, appearing to attach much importance to it, for he began praising a preacher who was doing wonders at the cathedral, and whom all the ladies were rushing to hear. Still, if he did not ask for any explanation, others, later on, might prove less discreet. So she thought well to get down each time at the Croix Rouge, so that the good folk of her village who saw her on the stairs should suspect nothing. One day, however, Monsieur Lheureux met her coming out of the Hôtel de Boulogne on Léon's arm, and she was frightened, thinking he would gossip. He was not such a fool. But 3 days after, he came to her room, shut the door, and said, "I must have some money." She declared she could not give him any. Lheureux burst into lamentations and reminded her of all the kindnesses he had shown her. In fact, of the 2 bills signed by Charles, Emma up to the present had paid only one. As to the second, the shopkeeper, at her request, had consented to replace it by another, which again had been renewed for a long date. Then he drew from his pocket a list of goods not paid for, to wit, the curtains, the carpet, the material for the armchairs, several dresses, and divers articles of dress, the bills for which amounted to about 2,000 francs. She bowed her head. He went on, "But if you haven't any ready money, you have an estate." And he reminded her of a miserable little hovel situated at Barneville, near Aumale, that brought in almost nothing. It had formerly been part of a small farm sold by Monsieur Bovary senior, for Lheureux knew everything, even to the number of acres and the names of the neighbours. "If I were in your place," he said, "I should clear myself of my debts and have money left over." She pointed out the difficulty of getting a purchaser. He held out the hope of finding one, but she asked him how she should manage to sell it. "Haven't you your power of attorney?" he replied. The phrase came to her like a breath of fresh air. "Leave me the bill," said Emma. "Oh, it isn't worthwhile," answered Leroux. He came back the following week, and boasted of having, after much trouble, at last discovered a certain Langlois, who, for a long time, had had an eye on the property, but without mentioning his price. "Never mind the price," she cried. But they would, on the contrary, have to wait to sound the fellow. The thing was worth a journey, and as she could not undertake it, he offered to go to the place to have an interview with Langlois. On his return, he announced that the purchaser proposed 4,000 francs. Emma was radiant at this news. "Frankly," he added, "that's a good price." She drew half the sum at once, and when she was about to pay her account, the shopkeeper said, "It really grieves me, on my word, to see you depriving yourself all at once of such a big sum as that." Then she looked at the banknotes, and dreaming of the unlimited number of rendezvous represented by those 2,000 francs, she stammered, "What? What?" "Oh," he went on, laughing good-naturedly, "one puts anything one likes on receipts. Don't you think I know what household affairs are?" And he looked at her fixedly, while in his hand he held 2 long papers that he slid between his nails. At last, opening his pocket-book, he spread out on the table 4 bills to order, each for 1,000 francs. "Sign these," he said, "and keep it all." She cried out, scandalized. "But if I give you the surplus," replied Monsieur Leroux impudently, "is that not helping you?" And taking a pen, he wrote at the bottom of the account, "Received of Madame Bovary, 4,000 francs. Now, who can trouble you, since in 6 months you'll draw the arrears for your cottage, and I don't make the last bill due until after you've been paid?" Emma grew rather confused in her calculations, and her ears tingled as if gold pieces, bursting from their bags, rang all round her on the floor. At last Leroux explained that he had a very good friend, Vincart, a broker at Rouen, who would discount these 4 bills. Then he himself would hand over to Madame the remainder after the actual debt was paid. But instead of 2,000 francs, he brought only 1,800, for the friend Vincart, which was only fair, had deducted 200 francs for commission and discount. Then he carelessly asked for a receipt. "You understand, in business, sometimes, and with the date, if you please, with the date." A horizon of realizable whims opened out before Emma. She was prudent enough to lay by 1,000 crowns, with which the first 3 bills were paid when they fell due, but the 4th by chance came to the house on a Thursday, and Charles, quite upset, patiently awaited his wife's return for an explanation. If she had not told him about this bill, it was only to spare him such domestic worries. She sat on his knees, caressed him, cooed to him, gave him a long enumeration of all the indispensable things that had been got on credit. "Really, you must confess, considering the quantity, that it isn't too dear." Charles, at his wits' end, soon had recourse to the eternal Leroux, who swore he would arrange matters if the doctor would sign him 2 bills, one of which was for 700 francs, payable in 3 months. In order to arrange for this, he wrote his mother a pathetic letter. Instead of sending a reply, she came herself. And when Emma wanted to know whether he had got anything out of her, "Yes," he replied, "but she wants to see the account." The next morning at daybreak Emma ran to Leroux to beg him to make out another account for not more than 1,000 francs, for to show the one for 4,000 it would be necessary to say that she had paid 2/3, and confess consequently the sale of the estate, a negotiation admirably carried out by the shopkeeper, and which in fact was only actually known later on. Despite the low price of each article, Madame Bovary senior, of course, thought the expenditure extravagant. "Couldn't you do without a carpet? Why have we covered the armchairs? In my time there was a single armchair in a house for elderly persons. At any rate it was so at my mother's, who was a good woman, I can tell you. Everybody can't be rich. No fortune can hold out against waste. I should be ashamed to coddle myself as you do, and yet I am old. I need looking after. And there they're fitting up gowns, fallals, what, silk for lining at 2 francs, when you can get jaconet for 10 sous, or even for 8, that would do well enough." Emma, lying on a lounge, replied as quietly as possible, "Oh, madame, enough, enough." The other went on lecturing her, predicting they would end in the workhouse. But it was Bovary's fault. Luckily he had promised to destroy that power of attorney. What? Ah, he swore he would, went on the good woman. Emma opened the window, called Charles, and the poor fellow was obliged to confess the promise torn from him by his mother. Emma disappeared, then came back quickly, and majestically handed her a thick piece of paper. "Thank you," said the old woman, and she threw the power of attorney into the fire. Emma began to laugh, a strident, piercing, continuous laugh. She had an attack of hysterics. "Oh, my God!" cried Charles. "Ah, you really are wrong. You come here and make scenes with her." His mother, shrugging her shoulders, declared it was all put on. But Charles, rebelling for the first time, took his wife's part, so that Madame Bovary senior said she would leave. She went the very next day, and on the threshold, as he was trying to detain her, she replied, "No, no, you love her better than me, and you are right. It is natural. For the rest, so much the worse. You will see. Good day, for I am not likely to come soon again, as you say, to make scenes." Charles, nevertheless, was very crestfallen before Emma, who did not hide the resentment she still felt at his want of confidence, and it needed many prayers before she would consent to have another power of attorney. He even accompanied her to Monsieur Guillemin to have a second one, just like the other, drawn up. "I understand," said the notary, "a man of science can't be worried with the practical details of life." And Charles felt relieved by this comfortable reflection, which gave his weakness the flattering appearance of higher preoccupation. And what an outburst the next Thursday at the hotel in their room with Léon! She laughed, cried, sang, sent for sherbet, wanted to smoke cigarettes, seemed to him wild and extravagant, but adorable, superb. He did not know what recreation of her whole being drove her more and more to plunge into the pleasures of life. She was becoming irritable, greedy, voluptuous, and she walked about the streets with him, carrying her head high, without fear, so she said, of compromising herself. At times, however, Emma shuddered at the sudden thought of meeting Rodolphe, for it seemed to her that although they were separated forever, she was not completely free from her subjugation to him. One night she did not return to Yonville at all. Charles lost his head with anxiety, and little Bertha would not go to bed without her mamma, and sobbed enough to break her heart. Justin had gone out searching the road at random. Monsieur Homais even had left his pharmacy. At last, at 11 o'clock, able to bear it no longer, Charles harnessed his chaise, jumped in, whipped up his horse, and reached the Croix Rouge about 2 o'clock in the morning. No one there. He thought that the clerk had perhaps seen her, but where did he live? Happily, Charles remembered his employer's address and rushed off there. Day was breaking, and he could distinguish the escutcheons over the door, and knocked. Someone, without opening the door, shouted out the required information, adding a few insults to those who disturb people in the middle of the night. The house inhabited by the clerk had neither bell, knocker, nor porter. Charles knocked loudly at the shutters with his hands. A policeman happened to pass by. Then he was frightened and went away. "I'm mad," he said. "No doubt they kept her to dinner at Monsieur Lormeaux." But the Lormeaux no longer lived at Rouen. She probably stayed to look after Madame Dubreuil. Why, Madame Dubreuil has been dead these 10 months. Where can she be? An idea occurred to him. At a café he asked for a directory, and hurriedly looked for the name of Mademoiselle Lempereur, who lived at number 74, Rue de la Renelle de Remarquinière. As he was turning into the street, Emma herself appeared at the other end of it. He threw himself upon her rather than embraced her, crying, "What kept you yesterday?" "I was not well." "What was it? Where? How?" She passed her hand over her forehead and answered, "At Mademoiselle Lempereur's." "I was sure of it. I was going there." "Oh, it isn't worth while," said Emma. "She went out just now. But for the future, don't worry. I do not feel free, you see, if I know that the least delay upsets you like this." This was a sort of permission that she gave herself, so as to get perfect freedom in her escapades. and she profited by it freely, fully. When she was seized with a desire to see Léon, she set out upon any pretext, and as he was not expecting her on that day, she went to fetch him at his office. It was a great delight at first, but soon he no longer concealed the truth, which was that his master complained very much about these interruptions. "Pshaw, come along," she said, and he slipped out. She wanted him to dress all in black and grow a pointed beard, to look like the portrait of Louis XIII. She wanted to see his lodgings, thought them poor. He blushed at them, but she did not notice this, then advised him to buy some curtains like hers, and as he objected to the expense, you care for your money," she said, laughing. Each time Léon had to tell her everything that he had done since their last meeting. She asked him for some verses for herself, a love poem in honour of her. But he never succeeded in getting a rhyme for the second verse, and at last ended by copying a sonnet in a keepsake. This was less from vanity than from the one desire of pleasing her. He did not question her ideas, he accepted all her tastes. He was rather becoming her mistress than she his. She had tender words and kisses that thrilled his soul. Where could she have learnt this corruption, almost incorporeal in the strength of its profanity and dissimulation? End of Part 3, Chapter 5. Part 3, Chapter 6 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 6. During the journeys he made to see her, Léon had often dined at the chemist's, and he felt obliged, from politeness, to invite him in turn. "With pleasure," Monsieur Homais replied. "Besides, I must invigorate my mind, for I am getting rusty here. We'll go to the theatre, to the restaurant. We'll make a night of it." "Oh, my dear," tenderly murmured Madame Homais, alarmed at the vague perils he was preparing to brave. "Well, what? Do you think I am not sufficiently ruining my health here amid the continual emanations of the pharmacy? But there, that is the way with women. They are jealous of science, and then are opposed to our taking the most legitimate distractions. No matter. Count upon me. One of these days I shall turn up at Rouen, and we'll go the pace together." The druggist would formerly have taken good care not to use such an expression, but he was cultivating a gay Parisian style, which he thought in the best taste, and like his neighbour Madame Bovary, he questioned the clerk curiously about the customs of the capital. He even talked slang to dazzle the bourgeois, saying bender, crummy, dandy, macaroni, the cheese, cut my stick, and I'll hook it, for I'm going. So, one Thursday, Emma was surprised to meet Monsieur Homais in the kitchen of the Lion d'Or, wearing a traveller's costume, that is to say, wrapped in an old cloak which no one knew he had, while he carried a valise in one hand and the foot-warmer of his establishment in the other. He had confided his intentions to no one, for fear of causing the public anxiety by his absence. The idea of seeing again the place where his youth had been spent no doubt excited him, for during the whole journey he never ceased talking, and as soon as he had arrived he jumped quickly out of the diligence to go in search of Léon. In vain the clerk tried to get rid of him. Monsieur Homais dragged him off to the large Café de la Normandie, which he entered majestically, not raising his hat, thinking it very provincial to uncover in any public place. Emma waited for Léon 3/4 of an hour. At last she ran to his office, and lost in all sorts of conjectures, accusing him of indifference and reproaching herself for her weakness, she spent the afternoon, her face pressed against the window-panes. At 2 o'clock they were still at a table opposite each other. The large room was emptying. The stovepipe, in the shape of a palm tree, spread its gilt leaves over the white ceiling, and near them, outside the window, in the bright sunshine, a little fountain gurgled in a white basin, where, in the midst of watercress and asparagus, 3 torpid lobsters stretched across to some quails that lay heaped up in a pile on their sides. Homais was enjoying himself. Although he was even more intoxicated with the luxury than the rich fare, the pomade wine all the same rather excited his faculties, and when the omelette au rhum appeared, he began propounding immoral theories about women. What seduced him above all else was chic. He admired an elegant toilette in a well-furnished apartment, and as to bodily qualities, he didn't dislike a young girl. Léon watched the clock in despair. The druggist went on drinking, eating, and talking. "You must be very lonely," he said suddenly, "here at Rouen. To be sure, your lady-love doesn't live far away." And the other blushed. "Come now, be frank. Can you deny that at Yonville—" The young man stammered something. "At Madame Bovary's you're not making love to—" "To whom?" "The servant." He was not joking, but vanity getting the better of all prudence, Léon, in spite of himself, protested. Besides, he only liked dark women. "I approve of that," said the chemist. "They have more passion." And whispering into his friend's ear, he pointed out the symptoms by which one could find out if a woman had passion. He even launched into an ethnographic digression. The German was vapourish, the Frenchwoman licentious, the Italian passionate. "And negresses?" asked the clerk. "They are an artistic taste," said Homais. "Waiter, 2 cups of coffee." "Are we going?" at last asked Léon impatiently. "Ja!" But before leaving he wanted to see the proprietor of the establishment and made him a few compliments. Then the young man, to be alone, alleged he had some business engagement. "Ah, I will escort you," said Homais. And all the while he was walking through the streets with him, he talked of his wife, his children, of their future, and of his business, told him in what a decayed condition it had formerly been, and to what a degree of perfection he had raised it. Arrived in front of the Hôtel de Boulogne, Léon left him abruptly, ran up the stairs, and found his mistress in great excitement. At mention of the chemist she flew into a passion. He, however, piled up good reasons. It wasn't his fault. Didn't she know Homais? Did she believe that he would prefer his company? But she turned away. He drew her back, and sinking on his knees, clasped her waist with his arms in a languorous pose, full of concupiscence and supplication. She was standing up. Her large flashing eyes looked at him seriously, almost terribly. Then tears obscured them. Her red eyelids were lowered. She gave him her hands, and Léon was pressing them to his lips when a servant appeared to tell the gentleman that he was wanted. "You will come back," she said. "Yes, but when?" "Immediately." "It's a trick," said the chemist when he saw Léon. "I wanted to interrupt this visit that seemed to me to annoy you. Let's go and have a glass of Garou at Brideau." Léon vowed that he must get back to his office. Then the druggist joked him about quill drivers and the law. "Leave Cujas and Bartol alone a bit. Who the devil prevents you? Be a man. Let's go to Brideau's. You'll see his dog. It's very interesting." And as the clerk still insisted, "I'll go with you. I'll read a paper while I wait for you, or turn over the leaves of a code." Léon, bewildered by Emma's anger, Monsieur Homais' chatter, and perhaps by the heaviness of the luncheon, was undecided, and as it were fascinated by the chemist, who kept repeating, "Let's go to Brideau. It's just by here, in the Rue Malpalu." Then, through cowardice, through stupidity, through that indefinable feeling that drags us into the most distasteful acts, he allowed himself to be led off to Brideau's, whom they found in his small yard superintending 3 workmen who panted as they turned the large wheel of a machine for making seltzer water. Homais gave them some good advice. He embraced Brideau. They took some Garou. 20 times Léon tried to escape, but the other seized him by the arm, saying, "Presently, I'm coming. We'll go to the Fanal de Rouen to see the fellows there. I'll introduce you to Tournassin." At last he managed to get rid of him, and rushed straight to the hotel. Emma was no longer there. She had just gone in a fit of anger. She detested him now. This failing to keep their rendezvous seemed to her an insult, and she tried to rake up other reasons to separate herself from him. He was incapable of heroism, weak, banal, more spiritless than a woman, avaricious too, and cowardly. Then, growing calmer, she at length discovered that she had, no doubt, calumniated him. But the disparaging of those we love always alienates us from them to some extent. We must not touch our idols. The guilt sticks to our fingers. They gradually came to talking more frequently of matters outside their love, and in the letters that Emma wrote him she spoke of flowers, verses, the moon and the stars, naive resources of a waning passion, striving to keep itself alive by all external aids. She was constantly promising herself a profound felicity on her next journey. Then she confessed to herself that she felt nothing extraordinary. This disappointment quickly gave way to a new hope, and Emma returned to him more inflamed, more eager than ever. She undressed brutally, tearing off the thin laces of her corset that nestled around her hips like a gliding snake. She went on tiptoe, barefooted, to see once more that the door was closed. Then, pale, serious, and without speaking, with one movement she threw herself upon his breast with a long shudder. Yet there was upon that brow covered with cold drops, on those quivering lips, in those wild eyes, in the strain of those arms, something vague and dreary that seemed to Léon to glide between them subtly, as if to separate them. He did not dare to question her, but seeing her so skilled, she must have passed, he thought, through every experience of suffering and of pleasure. What had once charmed now frightened him a little. Besides, he rebelled against his absorption, daily more marked, by her personality. He begrudged Emma this constant victory. He even strove not to love her. Then, when he heard the creaking of her boots, he turned coward, like drunkards at the sight of strong drinks. She did not fail, in truth, to lavish all sorts of attention upon him, from the delicacies of food to the coquetries of dress and languishing looks. She brought roses to her breast from Yonville, which she threw into his face, was anxious about his health, gave him advice as to his conduct, and in order the more surely to keep her hold on him, hoping perhaps that heaven would take her part, she tied a medal of the Virgin round his neck. She inquired, like a virtuous mother, about his companions. She said to him, "Don't see them, don't go out, think only of ourselves, love me." She would have liked to be able to watch over his life, and the idea occurred to her of having him followed in the streets. Near the hotel there was always a kind of loafer who accosted travellers, and who would not refuse. But her pride revolted at this. "Bah, so much the worse. Let him deceive me. What does it matter to me? As if I cared for him." One day, when they had parted early, and she was returning alone along the boulevard, she saw the walls of her convent. Then she sat down on a form in the shade of the elm trees. How calm that time had been! How she longed for the ineffable sentiment of love that she had tried to figure to herself out of books. The first months of her marriage, her rides in the wood, the Viscount that waltzed, and Lagardy singing, all repassed before her eyes. And Léon suddenly appeared to her as far off as the others. "Yet I love him," she said to herself. No matter, she was not happy. She never had been. Whence came this insufficiency in life, this instantaneous turning to decay of everything on which she leant? But if there was somewhere a being strong and beautiful, a valiant nature, full at once of exaltation and refinement, a poet's heart in an angel's form, a lyre with sounding chords, ringing out elegiac epithalamia to heaven, why perchance should she not find him? Ah, how impossible! Besides, nothing was worth the trouble of seeking it. Everything was a lie. Every smile hid a yawn of boredom, every joy a curse, all pleasure satiety, and the sweetest kisses left upon your lips only the unattainable desire for a greater delight. A metallic clang droned through the air, and 4 strokes were heard from the convent clock. 4 o'clock, and it seemed to her that she had been there on that form an eternity. but an infinity of passions may be contained in a minute, like a crowd in a small space. Emma lived all absorbed in hers, and troubled no more about money matters than an archduchess. Once, however, a wretched-looking man, rubicund and bald, came to her house, saying he had been sent by Monsieur Vincart of Rouen. He took out the pins that held together the side pockets of his long green overcoat, stuck them into his sleeve, and politely handed her a paper. It was a bill for 700 francs, signed by her, and which Lheureux, in spite of all his professions, had paid away to Vincart. She sent her servant for him. He would not come. Then the stranger, who had remained standing, casting right and left curious glances that his thick fair eyebrows hid, asked with a naive air, "What answer am I to take to Monsieur Vincart?" "Oh," said Emma, "tell him that I haven't it. I will send next week. He must wait. Yes, till next week." And the fellow went without another word. But the next day at 12 o'clock she received a summons, and the sight of the stamped paper, on which appeared several times in large letters, "Maître Harengue, bailiff at Bouchy," so frightened her that she rushed in hot haste to the linen draper's. She found him in his shop, doing up a parcel. "Your obedient," he said. "I am at your service." But Lheureux, all the same, went on with his work, helped by a young girl of about 13, somewhat hunchbacked, who was at once his clerk and his servant. Then, his clogs clattering on the shop-boards, he went up in front of Madame Bovary to the first door, and introduced her into a narrow closet, where, in a large bureau in sapon wood, lay some ledgers, protected by a horizontal padlocked iron bar. Against the wall, under some remnants of calico, one glimpsed a safe, but of such dimensions that it must contain something besides bills and money. Monsieur Lheureux, in fact, went in for pawnbroking, and it was there that he had put Madame Bovary's gold chain, together with the earrings of poor old Tellier, who, at last forced to sell out, had bought a meagre stock of grocery at Quincampoix, where he was dying of catarrh among his candles that were less yellow than his face. Lheureux sat down in a large cane armchair, saying, "What news?" "See!" And she showed him the paper. "Well, how can I help it?" Then she grew angry, reminding him of the promise he had given not to pay away her bills. He acknowledged it. "But I was pressed myself. The knife was at my own throat." "And what will happen now?" she went on. "Oh, it's very simple. A judgment and then a distraint. That's about it." Emma kept down a desire to strike him, and asked gently if there was no way of quieting Monsieur Vincart. "I dare say! Quiet Vincart! You don't know him. He's more ferocious than an Arab." Still, Monsieur Lheureux must interfere. "Well, listen. It seems to me so far I've been very good to you." And opening one of his ledgers, "See," he said. Then, running up the page with his finger, let's see. August the 3rd, 200 francs. June 17th, 150. March 23rd, 46. In April—" He stopped, as if afraid of making some mistake. "Not to speak of the bills signed by Monsieur Bovary, one for 700 francs and another for 300. As to your little instalments, with the interest, why, there's no end to them. One gets quite muddled over 'em. I'll have nothing more to do with it." She wept. She even called him her good Monsieur Lheureux. But he always fell back upon "that rascal Vincart." Besides, he hadn't a brass farthing. No one was paying him nowadays. They were eating his coat off his back. A poor shopkeeper like him couldn't advance money. Emma was silent, and Monsieur Lheureux, who was biting the feathers of a quill, no doubt became uneasy at her silence, for he went on, "Unless one of these days I have something coming in, I might—" "Besides," said she, "as soon as the balance of Banneville—" "What?" And on hearing that Langlois had not yet paid, he seemed much surprised. Then, in a honeyed voice, "And we agree, you say?" "Oh, do anything you like." On this he closed his eyes to reflect, wrote down a few figures, and declaring it would be very difficult for him, that the affair was shady and that he was being bled, he wrote out 4 bills to 250 francs each, to fall due month by month. "Provided that Vincart will listen to me. However, it's settled. I don't play the fool. I'm straight enough." Next he carelessly showed her several new goods, not one of which, however, was in his opinion worthy of Madame. "When I think that there's a dress at 3 halfpenny a yard and warranted fast colours, and yet they actually swallow it. Of course, you understand one doesn't tell them what it really is." He hoped by this confession of dishonesty to others to quite convince her of his probity to her. Then he called her back to show her 3 yards of guipure that he had lately picked up at a sale. "Isn't it lovely?" said Lheureux. "It is very much used now for the backs of armchairs. It's quite the rage." And, more ready than a juggler, he wrapped up the guipure in some blue paper and put it in Emma's hands. "But at least let me know—" "Yes, another time," he replied, turning on his heel. That same evening she urged Bovary to write to his mother, to ask her to send as quickly as possible the whole of the balance due from the father's estate. The mother-in-law replied that she had nothing more. The winding up was over, and there was due to them, besides Barneville, an income of 600 francs, that she would pay them punctually. Then Madame Bovary sent in accounts to 2 or 3 patients, and she made large use of this method, which was very successful. She was always careful to add a postscript. "Do not mention this to my husband. You know how proud he is. Excuse me. Yours obediently." There were some complaints. She intercepted them. To get money she began selling her old gloves, her old hats, the old odds and ends, and she bargained rapaciously, her peasant blood standing her in good stead. Then, on her journey to town, she picked up knick-knacks second-hand, that in default of anyone else Monsieur Leroux would certainly take off her hands. She bought ostrich feathers, Chinese porcelain, and trunks. She borrowed from Félicité, from Madame Lefrançois, from the landlady at the Croix Rouge, from everybody, no matter where. With the money she at last received from Barneville, she paid 2 bills. The other 1,500 francs fell due. She renewed the bills, and thus it was continually. Sometimes, it is true, she tried to make a calculation, but she discovered things so exorbitant that she could not believe them possible. Then she recommenced, soon got confused, gave it all up, and thought no more about it. The house was very dreary now. Tradesmen were seen leaving it with angry faces. Handkerchiefs were lying about on the stoves, and little Bertha, to the great scandal of Madame Homais, wore stockings with holes in them. If Charles timidly ventured a remark, she answered roughly that it wasn't her fault. What was the meaning of all these fits of temper? He explained everything through her old nervous illness, and reproaching himself with having taken her infirmities for faults, accused himself of egotism, and longed to go and take her in his arms. "Ah, no," he said to himself, "I should worry her." And he did not stir. After dinner he walked about alone in the garden. He took little Bertha on his knees, and unfolding his medical journal, tried to teach her to read. But the child, who never had any lessons, soon looked up with large, sad eyes and began to cry. Then he comforted her, went to fetch water in her can to make rivers on the sand path, or broke off branches from the privet hedge to plant trees in the beds. This did not spoil the garden much, all choked now with long weeds. They owed Lestiboudois for so many days. Then the child grew cold and asked for her mother. "Call the servant," said Charles. "You know, dearie, that mamma does not like to be disturbed." Autumn was setting in, and the leaves were already falling, as they did 2 years ago when she was ill. Where would it all end? And he walked up and down, his hands behind his back. Madame was in her room, which no one entered. She stayed there all day long, torpid, half-dressed, and from time to time burning Turkish pastilles which she had bought at Rouen in an Algerian shop. In order not to have at night this sleeping man stretched at her side, by dint of manoeuvring, she at last succeeded in banishing him to the 2nd floor, while she read till morning extravagant books full of pictures of orgies and thrilling situations. Often, seized with fear, she cried out, and Charles hurried to her. "Oh, go away," she would say. Or at other times, consumed more ardently than ever by that inner flame to which adultery added fuel, panting, tremulous, all desire, she threw open her window, breathed in the cold air, shook loose in the wind her masses of hair, too heavy, and gazing upon the stars, longed for some princely love. She thought of him, of Léon. She would then have given anything for a single one of those meetings that surfeited her. These were her gala days. She wanted them to be sumptuous, and when he alone could not pay the expense, she made up the deficit liberally, which happened pretty well every time. He tried to make her understand that they would be quite as comfortable somewhere else, in a smaller hotel, but she always found some objection. One day she drew 6 small silver-gilt spoons from her bag. They were old Rouault's wedding present, begging him to pawn them at once for her. And Léon obeyed, though the proceeding annoyed him. He was afraid of compromising himself. Then, on reflection, he began to think his mistress's ways were growing odd, and that they were perhaps not wrong in wishing to separate him from her. In fact, someone had sent his mother a long, anonymous letter to warn her that he was ruining himself with a married woman, and the good lady at once, conjuring up the eternal bugbear of families, the vague, pernicious creature, the siren, the monster, who dwells fantastically in depths of love, wrote to Lawyer Dubercage, his employer, who behaved perfectly in the affair. He kept him for 3/4 of an hour, trying to open his eyes, to warn him of the abyss into which he was falling. Such an intrigue would damage him later on, when he set up for himself. He implored him to break with her, and if he would not make this sacrifice in his own interest, to do it at least for his, Dubercage's, sake. At last Léon swore he would not see Emma again, and he reproached himself with not having kept his word, considering all the worry and lectures this woman might still draw down upon him, without reckoning the jokes made by his companions as they sat round the stove in the morning. Besides, he was soon to be head clerk. It was time to settle down. So he gave up his flute, exalted sentiments, and poetry, for every bourgeois in the flush of his youth, were it but for a day, a moment, has believed himself capable of immense passions, of lofty enterprises. The most mediocre libertine has dreamed of sultanas. Every notary bears within him the debris of a poet. He was bored now when Emma suddenly began to sob on his breast, and his heart, like the people who can only stand a certain amount of music, dozed to the sound of a love whose delicacies he no longer noted. They knew one another too well for any of those surprises of possession that increase its joys 100-fold. She was as sick of him as he was weary of her. Emma found again in adultery all the platitudes of marriage. But how to get rid of him? Then, though she might feel humiliated at the baseness of such enjoyment, she clung to it from habit or from corruption, and each day she hungered after them the more, exhausting all felicity in wishing for too much of it. She accused Léon of her baffled hopes, as if he had betrayed her, and she even longed for some catastrophe that would bring about their separation, since she had not the courage to make up her mind to it herself. She none the less went on writing him love letters, in virtue of the notion that a woman must write to her lover. But whilst she wrote, it was another man she saw, a phantom fashioned out of her most ardent memories, of her finest reading, her strongest lusts. And at last he became so real, so tangible, that she palpitated, wondering, without, however, the power to imagine him clearly. So lost was he, like a god, beneath the abundance of his attributes. He dwelt in that azure land where silk ladders hang from balconies under the breath of flowers, in the light of the moon. She felt him near her. He was coming, and would carry her right away in a kiss. Then she fell back exhausted, for these transports of vague love wearied her more than great debauchery. She now felt constant ache all over her. Often she even received summonses, stamped paper that she barely looked at. She would have liked not to be alive, or to be always asleep. On mid-Lent she did not return to Yonville, but in the evening went to a masked ball. She wore velvet breeches, red stockings, a club wig, and three-cornered hat cocked on one side. She danced all night to the wild tones of the trombones. People gathered round her, and in the morning she found herself on the steps of the theatre, together with 5 or 6 masks, débardeuses, and sailors, Léon's comrades, who were talking about having supper. The neighbouring cafes were full. They caught sight of one on the harbour, a very indifferent restaurant, whose proprietor showed them to a little room on the 4th floor. The men were whispering in a corner, no doubt consorting about expenses. There were a clerk, 2 medical students, and a shopman. What company for her! As to the women, Emma soon perceived from the tone of their voices that they must almost belong to the lowest class. Then she was frightened, pushed back her chair, and cast down her eyes. The others began to eat. She ate nothing. Her head was on fire, her eyes smarted, and her skin was iced cold. In her head she seemed to feel the floor of the ballroom rebounding again beneath the rhythmical pulsation of the thousands of dancing feet. And now the smell of the punch, the smoke of the cigars made her giddy. She fainted, and they carried her to the window. Day was breaking, and a great stain of purple colour broadened out in the pale horizon over the St. Catherine hills. The livid river was shivering in the wind. There was no one on the bridges. The street lamps were going out. She revived and began thinking of Bertha, asleep yonder in the servants' room. Then a cart filled with long strips of iron passed by and made a devilling metallic vibration against the walls of the houses. She slipped away suddenly, threw off her costume, told Léon she must get back, and at last was alone at the Hotel de Boulogne. Everything, even herself, was now unbearable to her. She wished that, taking wings like a bird, she could fly somewhere, far away, to regions of purity, and there grow young again. She went out, across the boulevard, the Place Cauchoir and the Faubourg, as far as an open street that overlooked some gardens. She walked rapidly, the fresh air calming her, and little by little the faces of the crowd, the masks, the quadrilles, the lights, the supper, those women, all disappeared like mists fading away. Then, reaching the Croix Rouge, she threw herself on the bed of her little room on the 2nd floor, where there were pictures of the Tour de Nesle. At 4 o'clock Hiver awoke her. When she got home, Félicité showed her behind the clock a grey paper. She read, "In virtue of the Caesar, in execution of a judgment." What judgment? As a matter of fact, the evening before another paper had been brought that she had not yet seen, and she was stunned by these words: "By order of the King, law and justice to Madame Bovary." Then, skipping several lines, she read, "Within 24 hours, without fail." But what? To pay the sum of 8,000 francs. And there was even at the bottom, "She will be constrained thereto by every form of law, and notably by a writ of distraint on her furniture and effects." What was to be done? In 24 hours, tomorrow. Lheureux, she thought, wanted to frighten her again, for she saw through all his devices, the object of his kindnesses. What reassured her was the very magnitude of the sum. However, by dint of buying and not paying, of borrowing, signing bills, and renewing these bills that grew at each new falling in, she had ended by preparing a capital for Monsieur Lheureux, which he was impatiently awaiting for his speculations. She presented herself at his place with an off-hand air. "You know what has happened to me? No doubt it's a joke." "How so?" He turned away slowly, and folding his arms, said to her, "My good lady, did you think I should go on to all eternity being your purveyor and banker for the love of God? Now be just. I must get back what I've laid out. Now be just." She cried out against the debt. "Ah, so much the worse. The court has admitted it. There's a judgment. It's been notified to you. Besides, it isn't my fault. It's Vancar's. Could you not? Oh, nothing whatsoever. But still, now, talk it over. And she began beating about the bush. She had known nothing about it. It was a surprise. Whose fault is that? Said Leroux, bowing ironically. While I'm slaving like a nigger, you go gallivanting about. Ah, no lecturing. It never does any harm, he replied. She turned coward. She implored him. She even pressed her pretty white and slender hand against the shopkeeper's knee. There, that'll do. Anyone would think you wanted to seduce me. You are a wretch, she cried. Oh, go it, go it. I will show you up. I shall tell my husband. All right, I too. I'll show your husband something. And Leroux drew from his strong-box the receipt for 1,800 francs that she had given him when Vancard had discounted the bills. Do you think, he added, that he'll not understand your little theft, the poor dear man? She collapsed, more overcome than if felled by the blow of a pole-axe. He was walking up and down from the window to the bureau, repeating all the while, "Ah, I'll show him, I'll show him." Then he approached her, and in a soft voice said, "It isn't pleasant, I know, but after all no bones are broken, and since that is the only way that is left for you paying back my money—" "But where am I to get any?" said Emma, wringing her hands. "Bah! When one has friends like you!" And he looked at her in so keen, so terrible a fashion that she shuddered to her very heart. "I promised you," she said, "to sign. I've enough of your signatures." "I will sell something." "Get along," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "You've not got anything." And he called through the peephole that looked down into the shop, "Annette, don't forget the 3 coupons of number 14. The servant appeared. Emma understood, and asked how much money would be wanted to put a stop to the proceedings. "It is too late." "But if I brought you several thousand francs, a quarter of the sum, a third, perhaps the whole—" "No, it's no use." And he pushed her gently towards the staircase. "I implore you, Monsieur Leroux, just a few days more." She was sobbing. "There, tears now." "You are driving me to despair." "What do I care?" said he, shutting the door. End of Part 3, Chapter 6. Part 3, Chapter 7 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 7. She was stoical the next day when Maître Hareng, the bailiff, with 2 assistants, presented himself at her house to draw up the inventory for the distraint. They began with Bovary's consulting room, and did not write down the phrenological head, which was considered an instrument of his profession. But in the kitchen they counted the plates, the saucepans, the chairs, the candlesticks, and in the bedroom all the knick-knacks on the what-not. They examined her dresses, the linen, the dressing-room, and her whole existence to its most intimate details was, like a corpse on whom a post-mortem is made, outspread before the eyes of these 3 men. Maître Hareng, buttoned up in his thin black coat, wearing a white choker and very tight footstraps, repeated from time to time, "Allow me, madame, you allow me?" Often he uttered exclamations, "Charming, very pretty." Then he began writing again, dipping his pen into the horn inkstand in his left hand. When they had done with the rooms, they went up to the attic. She kept a desk there in which Rodolphe's letters were locked. It had to be opened. "Ah, a correspondence," said Maître Hareng with a discreet smile. "But allow me, for I must make sure the box contains nothing else." And he tipped up the papers lightly as if to shake out Napoleons. Then she grew angered to see this coarse hand, with fingers red and pulpy like slugs, touching these pages against which her heart had beaten. They went at last. Félicité came back. Emma sent her out to watch for Bovary in order to keep him off, and they hurriedly installed the man in possession under the roof, where he swore he would remain. During the evening Charles seemed to her careworn. Emma watched him with a look of anguish, fancying she saw an accusation in every line of his face. Then, when her eyes wandered over the chimney-piece ornamented with Chinese screens, over the large curtains, the armchairs, all those things, in a word, that had softened the bitterness of her life, remorse seized her, or rather an immense regret that, far from crushing, irritated her passion. Charles placidly poked the fire, both his feet on the fire-dogs. Once the man, no doubt bored in his hiding-place, made a slight noise. "Is anyone walking upstairs?" said Charles. "No," she replied. "It is a window that has been left open and is rattling in the wind." The next day, Sunday, she went to Rouen to call on all the brokers whose names she knew. They were at their country places or on journeys. She was not discouraged, and those whom she did manage to see she asked for money, declaring she must have some, and that she would pay it back. Some laughed in her face. All refused. At 2 o'clock she hurried to Léon and knocked at the door. No one answered. At length he appeared. "What brings you here?" "Do I disturb you?" "No, but—" And he admitted that his landlord didn't like his having women there. "I must speak to you," she went on. Then he took down the key, but she stopped him. No, down there, in our home." And they went to their room at the Hotel de Boulogne. On arriving, she drank off a large glass of water. She was very pale. She said to him, "Léon, will you do me a service?" And shaking him by both hands that she grasped tightly, she added, "Listen, I want 8,000 francs." "But you are mad." "Not yet." And thereupon, telling him the story of the distraint, she explained her distress to him, for Charles knew nothing of it. Her mother-in-law detested her. Old Rouault could do nothing. But he, Léon, he would set about finding this indispensable sum. "How on earth can I?" "What a coward you are!" she cried. Then he said stupidly, "You are exaggerating the difficulty. Perhaps with 1,000 crowns or so the fellow could be stopped." All the greater reason to try and do something. It was impossible that they could not find 3,000 francs. Besides, Léon could be security instead of her. "Go, try. I will love you so." He went out and came back at the end of an hour, saying with solemn face, "I have been to 3 people with no success." Then they remained sitting face to face at the 2 chimney corners, motionless, in silence. Emma shrugged her shoulders as she stamped her feet. He heard her murmuring, "If I were in your place I should soon get some." "But where?" "At your office." And she looked at him. An infernal boldness looked out from her burning eyes, and their lids drew close together with a lascivious and encouraging look, so that the young man felt himself growing weak beneath the mute will of this woman who was urging him to a crime. Then he was afraid, and to avoid any explanation, he smote his forehead, crying, "Morel is to come back tonight. He will not refuse me, I hope." This was one of his friends, the son of a very rich merchant. "And I will bring it to you tomorrow," he added. Emma did not seem to welcome this hope with all the joy he had expected. Did she suspect the lie? He went on, blushing. "However, if you don't see me by 3 o'clock, do not wait for me, my darling. I must be off now. Forgive me. Goodbye." He pressed her hand, but it felt quite lifeless. Emma had no strength left for any sentiment. 4 o'clock struck, and she rose to return to Yonville, mechanically obeying the force of old habits. The weather was fine. It was one of those March days, clear and sharp, when the sun shines in a perfectly white sky. The Rouen folk in Sunday clothes were walking about with happy looks. She reached the Place du Pavis. People were coming out after vespers. The crowd flowed out through the 3 doors like a stream through the 3 arches of a bridge, and in the middle one, more motionless than a rock, stood the beadle. Then she remembered the day when, all anxious and full of hope, she had entered beneath this large nave that had opened out before her, less profound than her love, and she walked on weeping beneath her veil, giddy, staggering, almost fainting. "Take care!" cried a voice issuing from the gate of a courtyard that was thrown open. She stopped to let pass a black horse pawing the ground between the shafts of a tilbury, driven by a gentleman in sable furs. Who was it? She knew him. The carriage darted by and disappeared. Why, it was he, the Viscount. She turned away. The street was empty. She was so overwhelmed, so sad, that she had to lean against a wall to keep herself from falling. Then she thought she had been mistaken. Anyhow, she did not know. All within her and around her was abandoning her. She felt lost, sinking at random into indefinable abysses, and it was almost with joy that on reaching the Croix Rouge she saw the good Homais, who was watching a large box full of pharmaceutical stores being hoisted onto the Hirondelle. In his hand he held tied in a silk handkerchief 3 cheminots for his wife. Madame Homais was very fond of these small, heavy, turban-shaped loaves that are eaten in Lent with salt butter, a last vestige of Gothic food that goes back perhaps to the time of the Crusades, and with which the robust Normans gorged themselves of yore, fancying they saw on the table, in the light of the yellow torches, between tankards of hippocras and huge boars' heads, the heads of Saracens to be devoured. The druggist's wife crunched them up as they had done, heroically, despite her wretched teeth. And so whenever Homais journeyed to town, he never failed to bring her home some that he had bought at the great baker's in the Rue Massacre. "Charmed to see you," he said, offering Emma a hand to help her into the Hirondelle. Then he hung up his cheminots to the cords of the netting and remained bareheaded in an attitude pensive and Napoleonic. But when the blind man appeared, as usual, at the foot of the hill, he exclaimed, "I can't understand why the authorities tolerate such culpable industries. Such unfortunates should be locked up and forced to work. Progress, my word, creeps at a snail's pace. We are floundering about in mere barbarism." The blind man held out his hat that flapped about at the door as if it were a bag in the lining that had come unnailed. "This," said the chemist, "is a scrofulous affection." And though he knew the poor devil, he pretended to see him for the first time, murmured something about cornea, opaque cornea, sclerotic, facies, then asked him in a paternal tone, "My friend, have you long had this terrible infirmity? Instead of getting drunk at the public, you'd do better to die yourself." He advised him to take good wine, good beer, and good joints. The blind man went on with his song. He seemed, moreover, almost idiotic. At last Monsieur Homais opened his purse. "Now there's a sou. Give me back 2 leads, and don't forget my advice. You'd be the better for it." Yver openly cast some doubt on the efficacy of it, but the druggist said he would cure himself with an antiphlogistic pomade of his own composition, and he gave his address. "Monsieur Homais, near the market, pretty well known." "Now," said Yver, "for all this trouble you give us your performance." The blind man sank down on his haunches, with his head thrown back, whilst he rolled his greenish eyes, lolled out his tongue, and rubbed his stomach with both hands, as he uttered a kind of hollow yell like a famished dog. Emma, filled with disgust, threw him over her shoulder a 5-franc piece. It was all her fortune. It seemed to her very fine thus to throw it away. The coach had gone on again when suddenly Monsieur Homais leant out through the window, crying, "No farinaceous or milk food. Wear wool next the skin and expose the diseased parts to the smoke of juniper berries." The sight of the well-known objects that defiled before her eyes gradually diverted Emma from her present trouble. An intolerable fatigue overwhelmed her, and she reached her home stupefied, discouraged, almost asleep. "Come what may come," she said to herself, "and then who knows? Why, at any moment could not some extraordinary event occur? L'heureux might even die." At 9 o'clock in the morning she was awakened by the sound of voices in the Place. There was a crowd round the market reading a large bill fixed to one of the posts, and she saw Justin, who was climbing onto a stone and tearing down the bill. But at this moment the rural guard seized him by the collar. Monsieur Homais came out of his shop, and Mère Lefrangois, in the midst of the crowd, seemed to be perorating. "Madame, madame!" cried Félicité, running in. "It's abominable!" and the poor girl, deeply moved, handed her a yellow paper that she had just torn off the door. Emma read with a glance that all her furniture was for sale. Then they looked at one another silently. The servant and mistress had no secret one from the other. At last Félicité sighed. "If I were you, madame, I should go to Monsieur Guillemin." "Do you think?" And this question meant to say, "You, who know the house through the servant, has the master spoken sometimes of me?" "Yes, you do well to go there." She dressed, put on her black gown and her hood with jet beads, and that she might not be seen, there was still a crowd on the Place, she took the path by the river, outside the village. She reached the notary's gate quite breathless. The sky was sombre and a little snow was falling. At the sound of the bell, Théodore, in a red waistcoat, appeared on the steps. He came to open the door almost familiarly, as to an acquaintance, and showed her into the dining room. A large porcelain stove crackled beneath a cactus that filled up the niche in the wall, and in black wood frames against the oak-stained paper hung Steuben's Esmeralda and Chopin's Potiphar. The ready-laid table, the 2 silver chafing dishes, the crystal doorknobs, the parquet and the furniture, all shone with a scrupulous English cleanliness. The windows were ornamented at each corner with stained glass. "Now this," thought Emma, "is the dining-room I ought to have." The notary came in, pressing his palm-leaf dressing-gown to his breast with his left arm, while with the other hand he raised and quickly put on again his brown velvet cap, pretentiously cocked on the right side, whence looked out the ends of 3 fair curls drawn from the back of the head, following the line of his bald skull. After he had offered her a seat, he sat down to breakfast, apologizing profusely for his rudeness. "I have come," she said, "to beg you, sir—" "What, madame? I am listening." And she began explaining her position to him. Monsieur Guillemin knew it, being secretly associated with the linen-draper, from whom he always got capital for the loans on mortgages that he was asked to make. So he knew, and better than herself, the long story of the bills, small at first, bearing different names as endorsers, made out at long dates and constantly renewed, up to the day when, gathering together all the protested bills, the shopkeeper had bidden his friend Vainquart take in his own name all the necessary proceedings, not wishing to pass for a tiger with his fellow citizens. She mingled her story with recriminations against Lheureux, to which the notary replied from time to time with some insignificant word. Eating his cutlet and drinking his tea, he buried his chin in his sky-blue cravat, into which were thrust 2 diamond pins held together by a small gold chain, and he smiled a singular smile in a sugary, ambiguous fashion. But noticing that her feet were damp, he said, "Do get closer to the stove. Put your feet up against the porcelain." She was afraid of dirtying it. The notary replied in a gallant tone, "Beautiful things spoil nothing." Then she cried to move him, and growing moved herself, she began telling him about the poorness of her home, her worries, her wants. He could understand that, an elegant woman, and without leaving off eating, he had turned completely round towards her, so that his knee brushed against her boot, whose sole curled round it as it smoked against the stove. But when she asked for 1,000 sous, he closed his lips, and declared he was very sorry he had not had the management of her fortune before, for there were hundreds of ways very convenient, even for a lady, of turning her money to account. They might, either in the turf-peats of Grumesnil or building ground at Havre, almost without risk, have ventured on some excellent speculations, and he let her consume herself with rage at the thought of the fabulous sums that she would certainly have made. "How was it," he went on, "that you didn't come to me?" "I hardly know," she said. "Why, eh? Did I frighten you so much? It is I, on the contrary, who ought to complain. We hardly know one another, yet I am very devoted to you. You do not doubt that, I hope." He held out his hand, took hers, covered it with a greedy kiss, then held it on his knee, and he played delicately with her fingers whilst he murmured 1,000 blandishments. His insipid voice murmured like a running brook, A light shone in his eyes through the glimmering of his spectacles, and his hand was advancing up Emma's sleeve to press her arm. She felt against her cheek his panting breath. This man oppressed her horribly. She sprang up and said to him, "Sir, I am waiting." "For what?" said the notary, who suddenly became very pale. "This money." "But—" Then, yielding to the outburst of too powerful a desire, "Well, yes." He dragged himself towards her on his knees, regardless of his dressing gown. "For pity's sake, stay. I love you." He seized her by her waist. Madame Bovary's face flushed purple. She recoiled with a terrible look, crying, "You are taking a shameless advantage of my distress, sir. I am to be pitied, not to be sold." And she went out. The notary remained quite stupefied, his eyes fixed on his fine embroidered slippers. They were a love gift, and the sight of them at last consoled him. Besides, he reflected that such an adventure might have carried him too far. "What a wretch! What a scoundrel! What an infamy!" she said to herself as she fled with nervous steps beneath the aspens of the path. The disappointment of her failure increased the indignation of her outraged modesty. It seemed to her that Providence pursued her implacably, and strengthening herself in her pride, she had never felt so much esteem for herself, nor so much contempt for others. A spirit of warfare transformed her. She would have liked to strike all men, to spit in their faces, to crush them, and she walked rapidly straight on, pale, quivering, maddened, searching the empty horizon with tear-dimmed eyes, and as it were rejoicing in the hate that was choking her. When she saw her house, a numbness came over her. She could not go on, and yet she must. Besides, whither could she flee? Félicité was waiting for her at the door. "Well?" "No," said Emma. And for a quarter of an hour the two of them went over the various persons in Yonville who might perhaps be inclined to help her. But each time that Félicité named someone, Emma replied, "Impossible, they will not." "And the master will soon be in." "I know that well enough. Leave me alone." She had tried everything. There was nothing more to be done now, and when Charles came in she would have to say to him, "Go away. This carpet on which you are walking is no longer ours. In your own house you do not possess a chair, a pin, a straw, and it is I, poor man, who have ruined you." Then there would be a great sob. Next he would weep abundantly, and at last, the surprise past, he would forgive her. "Yes," she murmured, grinding her teeth, "he will forgive me. He who would give 1,000,000 if I would forgive him for having known me. Never, never." This thought of Bovary's superiority to her exasperated her. Then, whether she confessed or did not confess, presently, immediately, tomorrow, he would know the catastrophe all the same, so she must wait for this horrible scene and bear the weight of his magnanimity. The desire to return to Lheureux's seized her. What would be the use? To write to her father? It was too late, and perhaps she began to repent now that she had not yielded to that other when she heard the trot of a horse in the alley. It was he. He was opening the gate. He was whiter than the plaster wall. Rushing to the stairs, she ran out quickly to the square, and the wife of the mayor, who was talking to Lestiboudois in front of the church, saw her go in to the tax collector's. She hurried off to tell Madame Caron, and the two ladies went up to the attic, and, hidden by some linen spread across props, stationed themselves comfortably for overlooking the whole of Binet's room. He was alone in his garret, busy imitating in wood one of those indescribable bits of ivory, composed of crescents, of spheres hollowed out one within the other, the whole as straight as an obelisk and of no use whatever, and he was beginning on the last piece. He was nearing his goal. In the twilight of the workshop the white dust was flying from his tools like a shower of sparks under the hoofs of a galloping horse. The two wheels were turning, droning. Binet smiled, his chin lowered, his nostrils distended. and in a word seemed lost in one of those complete happinesses that no doubt belong only to commonplace occupations, which amuse the mind with facile difficulties and satisfy by a realization of that beyond which such minds have not a dream. "Ah, there she is!" exclaimed Madame Tuvache. But it was impossible, because of the lathe, to hear what she was saying. At last these ladies thought they made out the word francs, and Madame Tuvache whispered in a low voice, "She is begging him to give her time for paying her taxes." "Apparently," replied the other. They saw her walking up and down, examining the napkin rings, the candlesticks, the banister rails against the walls, while Binet stroked his beard with satisfaction. "Do you think she wants to order something of him?" said Madame Tuvache. "Why, he doesn't sell anything," objected her neighbour. The tax collector seemed to be listening with wide open eyes, as if he did not understand. She went on in a tender, suppliant manner. She came nearer to him, her breast heaving. They no longer spoke. "Is she making him advances?" said Madame Tuvache. Binet was scarlet to his very ears. She took hold of his hands. "Oh, it's too much!" And no doubt she was suggesting something abominable to him, for the tax collector, yet he was brave. He fought at Bautzen and at Lutzen, had been through the French campaign, and had even been recommended for the cross. Suddenly, as at the sight of a serpent, recoiled as far as he could from her, crying, "Madame, what do you mean?" "Women like that ought to be whipped," said Madame Tuvache. "But where is she?" continued Madame Caron, for she had disappeared while they spoke. Then, catching sight of her going up the Grande Rue and turning to the right as if making for the cemetery, they were lost in conjectures. "Nurse Rollet," she said on reaching the nurses, "I am choking. Unlace me." She fell on the bed, sobbing. Nurse Rollet covered her with a petticoat and remained standing by her side. Then, as she did not answer, the good woman withdrew, took her wheel, and began spinning flax. "Oh, leave off," she murmured, fancying she heard Binet's lathe. "What's bothering her?" said the nurse to herself. "Why has she come here?" She had rushed thither, impelled by a kind of horror that drove her from her home. Lying on her back, motionless and with staring eyes, she saw things but vaguely, although she tried to with idiotic persistence. She looked at the scales on the walls, 2 brands smoking end to end, and a long spider crawling over her head in a rent in the beam. At last she began to collect her thoughts. She remembered. One day. Léon. Oh, how long ago that was! The sun was shining on the river, and the clematis were perfuming the air. Then, carried away as by a rushing torrent, she soon began to recall the day before. "What time is it?" she asked. Merollet went out, raised the fingers of her right hand to that side of the sky that was brightest, and came back slowly, saying, "Nearly 3. "Ah, thanks, thanks." For he would come. He would have found some money. But he would perhaps go down yonder, not guessing she was here, and she told the nurse to run to her house to fetch him. "Be quick!" "But, my dear lady, I'm going. She wondered now that she had not thought of him from the first. Yesterday he had given his word. He would not break it. And she already saw herself at Lheureux's, spreading out her 3 banknotes on his bureau. Then she would have to invent some story to explain matters to Bovary. What should it be? The nurse, however, was a long while gone. But as there was no clock in the cot, Emma feared she was perhaps exaggerating the length of time. She began walking round the garden, step by step. She went into the path by the hedge and returned quickly, hoping that the woman would have come back by another road. At last, weary of waiting, assailed by fears that she thrust from her, no longer conscious whether she had been here a century or a moment, she sat down in a corner, closed her eyes and stopped her ears. The gate grated. She sprang up. Before she had spoken, Mère Rollet said to her, "There is no one at your house." "What?" "Oh, no one. And the doctor is crying. He is calling for you. They're looking for you." Emma answered nothing. She gasped as she turned her eyes about her, while the peasant woman, frightened at her face, drew back instinctively, thinking her mad. Suddenly she struck her brow and uttered a cry, for the thought of Rodolphe, like a flash of lightning in a dark night, had passed into her soul. He was so good, so delicate, so generous. And besides, should he hesitate to do her this service, she would know well enough how to constrain him to it by reawakening in a single moment their lost love. So she set out towards La Huchette, not seeing that she was hastening to offer herself to that which but a while ago had so angered her, not in the least conscious of her prostitution. End of Part 3, Chapter 7. Part 3, Chapter 8 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 8. She asked herself as she walked along, "What am I going to say? How shall I begin?" And as she went on, she recognized the thickets, the trees, the sea rushes on the hill, the chateau yonder. All the sensations of her first tenderness came back to her, and her poor aching heart opened out amorously. A warm wind blew in her face. The melting snow fell drop by drop from the buds to the grass. She entered as she used to through the small park gate. She reached the avenue bordered by a double row of dense lime trees. They were swaying their long, whispering branches to and fro. The dogs in their kennels all barked, and the noise of their voices resounded, but brought out no one. She went up the large straight staircase with wooden balusters that led to the corridor paved with dusty flags, into which several doors in a row opened, as in a monastery or an inn. He was at the top, right at the end, on the left. When she placed her fingers on the lock, her strength suddenly deserted her. She was afraid, almost wished he would not be there, though this was her only hope, her last chance of salvation. She collected her thoughts for one moment, and strengthening herself by the feeling of present necessity, went in. He was in front of the fire, both his feet on the mantelpiece, smoking a pipe. "What, is it you?" he said, getting up hurriedly. "Yes, it is I, Rodolphe. I should like to ask your advice." And despite all her efforts, it was impossible for her to open her lips. "You have not changed. You are charming as ever." "Oh," she replied bitterly, "they are poor charms since you disdained them." Then he began a long explanation of his conduct, excusing himself in vague terms, in default of being able to invent better. She yielded to his words, still more to his voice and the sight of him, so that she pretended to believe, or perhaps believed, in the pretext he gave for their rupture. This was a secret on which depended the honour, the very life of a third person. "No matter," she said, looking at him sadly. "I have suffered much." He replied philosophically, "Such is life." "Has life," Emma went on, "been good to you, at least, since our separation?" "Oh, neither good nor bad." "Perhaps it would have been better never to have parted." "Yes, perhaps." "You think so?" she said, drawing nearer, and she sighed. "Oh, Rodolphe, if you but knew, I loved you so." It was then that she took his hand, and they remained some time, their fingers intertwined, like that first day at the show. With a gesture of pride he struggled against this emotion, but sinking upon his breast, she said to him, "How did you think I could live without you? One cannot lose the habit of happiness. I was desolate. I thought I should die. I will tell you all about that, and you will see. And you fled from me." For all the 3 years he had carefully avoided her in consequence of that natural cowardice that characterizes the stronger sex. Emma went on with dainty little nods, more coaxing than an amorous kitten. "You love others. Confess it." "Oh, I understand them, dear. I excuse them. You probably seduced them as you seduced me. You are indeed a man. You have everything to make one love you. But we'll begin again, won't we? We will love one another. See, I'm laughing. I'm happy. Oh, speak." And she was charming to see, with her eyes in which trembled a tear, like the rain of a storm in a blue corolla. He had drawn her upon his knees, and with the back of his hand was caressing her smooth hair, where in the twilight was mirrored like a golden arrow one last ray of the sun. She bent down her brow. At last he kissed her on the eyelids quite gently with the tips of his lips. "Why, you've been crying. What for?" She burst into tears. Rodolphe thought this was an outburst of her love. As she did not speak, he took this silence for a last remnant of resistance, and then he cried out, "Oh, forgive me! You're the only one who pleases me. I was imbecile and cruel. I love you. I will love you always. What is it? Tell me." He was kneeling by her. "Well, I am ruined, Rodolphe. You must lend me 3,000 francs. But, said he, getting up slowly, while his face assumed a grave expression. "You know," she went on quickly, "that my husband had placed his whole fortune at a notary's. He ran away. So we borrowed. The patients don't pay us. Moreover, the settling of the estate is not yet done. We shall have the money later on. But today, for want of 3,000 francs, we are to be sold up. It is to be at once, this very moment, and counting upon your friendship, I have come to you." "Ah," thought Rodolphe, turning very pale. That was what she came for. At last he said with a calm air, "Dear madam, I have not got them." He did not lie. If he had had them, he would, no doubt, have given them, although it is generally disagreeable to do such fine things, a demand for money being, of all the winds that blow upon love, the coldest and most destructive. First she looked at him for some moments. "You have not got them?" she repeated several times. "You have not got them? I ought to have spared myself this last shame. You never loved me. You are no better than the others." She was betraying, ruining herself. Rodolphe interrupted her, declaring he was hard up himself. "Ah, I pity you," said Emma. "Yes, very much." And fixing her eyes upon an embossed carabine that shone against its panoply. "But when one is so poor, one doesn't have silver on the butt of one's gun. One doesn't buy a clock inlaid with tortoise shell," she went on, pointing to a Boule timepiece, "nor silver-gilt whistles for one's whips," and she touched them, "nor charms for one's watch. Oh, he wants for nothing, even to a liqueur stand in his room, for you love yourself. You live well. You have a chateau, farms, woods. You go hunting. You travel to Paris. Why, if it were but that," she cried, taking up 2 studs from the mantelpiece. "But the least of these trifles, one can get money for them. Oh, I do not want them. Keep them." And she threw the 2 links away from her, their gold chain breaking as it struck against the wall. "But I would have given you everything. I would have sold all, worked for you with my hands. I would have begged on the high roads for a smile, for a look, to hear you say thanks. And you sit there quietly in your armchair as if you had not made me suffer enough already. But for you, and you know it, I might have lived happily. What made you do it? Was it a bet? Yet you loved me. You said so. And but a moment since, it would have been better to have driven me away. My hands are hot with your kisses, and there is the spot on the carpet where at my knees you swore an eternity of love. You made me believe you. For 2 years you held me in the most magnificent, the sweetest dream. Eh? Our plans for the journey, do you remember? Oh, your letter, it tore my heart. And then when I come back to him, rich, happy, free, to implore the help the first stranger would give, a suppliant, and bringing back to him all my tenderness, he repulses me, because it would cost him 3,000 francs. "I haven't got them," replied Rodolphe, with that perfect calm with which resigned rage covers itself as with a shield. She went out. The walls trembled, the ceiling was crushing her, and she passed back through the long alley, stumbling against the heaps of dead leaves scattered by the wind. At last she reached the ha-ha hedge in front of the gate. She broke her nails against the lock in her haste to open it. Then 100 steps farther on, breathless, almost falling, she stopped. And now, turning round, she once more saw the impassive chateau, with the park, the gardens, the 3 courts, and all the windows of the façade. She remained lost in stupor, and having no more consciousness of herself than through the beating of her arteries that she seemed to hear bursting forth like a deafening music, filling all the fields. The earth beneath her feet was more yielding than the sea, and the furrows seemed to her immense brown waves breaking into foam. Everything in her head, of memories, ideas, went off at once like 1,000 pieces of fireworks. She saw her father, the rose closet, their room at home, another landscape. Madness was coming upon her. She grew afraid, and managed to recover herself, in a confused way it is true, for she did not in the least remember the cause of the terrible condition she was in, that is to say, the question of money. She suffered only in her love, and felt her soul passing from her in this memory, as wounded men, dying, feel their life ebb from their bleeding wounds. Night was falling. Crows were flying about. Suddenly it seemed to her that fiery spheres were exploding in the air like fulminating balls when they strike, and were whirling, to melt at last upon the snow between the branches of the trees. In the midst of each of them appeared the face of Rodolphe. They multiplied and drew near her, penetrating her. It all disappeared. She recognized the lights of the houses that shone through the fog. Now her situation, like an abyss, rose up before her. She was panting as if her heart would burst. Then, in an ecstasy of heroism that made her almost joyous, she ran down the hill, crossed the cow-plank, the footpath, the alley, the market, and reached the chemist's shop. She was about to enter, but at the sound of the bell someone might come, and slipping in by the gate, holding her breath, feeling her way along the walls, she went as far as the door of the kitchen, where a candle stuck on the stove was burning. Justin, in his shirt-sleeves, was carrying out a dish. "Ah, they're dining. I will wait." He returned. She tapped at the window. He went out. "The key, the one for upstairs, where he keeps the—" "What?" And he looked at her, astonished at the pallor of her face that stood out white against the black background of the night. She seemed to him extraordinarily beautiful and majestic as a phantom. Without understanding what she wanted, he had the presentiment of something terrible. But she went on quickly, in a love voice, in a sweet, melting voice. "I want it. Give it to me." As the partition wall was thin, they could hear the clatter of the forks on the plates in the dining-room. She pretended that she wanted to kill the rats that kept her from sleeping. "I must tell the master." "No, stay." Then, with an indifferent air, "Oh, it's not worth while. I'll tell him presently. Come, light me upstairs." She entered the corridor into which the laboratory door opened. Against the wall was a key labelled Capharnaum. "Justin!" called the druggist impatiently. "Let us go up." And he followed her. The key turned in the lock, and she went straight to the 3rd shelf, so well did her memory guide her, seized the blue jar, tore out the cork, plunged in her hand, and withdrawing it full of a white powder, she began eating it. "Stop!" he cried, rushing at her. "Hush! Someone will come." He was in despair, was calling out, "Say nothing, or all the blame will fall on your master." Then she went home, suddenly calmed, and with something of the serenity of one that had performed a duty. When Charles, distracted by the news of the distraint, returned home, Emma had just gone out. He cried aloud, wept, fainted, but she did not return. Where could she be? He sent Félicité to Homais, to Monsieur Tuvache, to Lheureux, to the Lion d'Or, everywhere, and in the intervals of his agony he saw his reputation destroyed, their fortune lost, Bertha's future ruined. By what? Not a word. He waited till 6 in the evening. At last, unable to bear it any longer, and fancying she had gone to Rouen, he set out along the high road, walked a mile, met no one, again waited, and returned home. She had come back. What was the matter? Why? Explain to me. She sat down at her writing table and wrote a letter, which she sealed slowly, adding the date and the hour. Then she said in a solemn tone, "You are to read it tomorrow. Till then, I pray you, do not ask me a single question. No, not one." "But, oh, leave me." She lay down full length on her bed. A bitter taste that she felt in her mouth awakened her. She saw Charles, and again closed her eyes. She was studying herself curiously to see if she were not suffering. But no, nothing as yet. She heard the ticking of the clock, the crackling of the fire, and Charles breathing as he stood upright by her bed. "Ah, it is but a little thing, death," she thought. "I shall fall asleep, and all will be over." She drank a mouthful of water and turned to the wall. The frightful taste of ink continued. "I am thirsty, so thirsty," she sighed. "What is it?" said Charles, who was handing her a glass. "It is nothing. Open the window. I'm choking." She was seized with a sickness so sudden that she had hardly time to draw out her handkerchief from under the pillow. "Take it away," she said quickly. "Throw it away." He spoke to her. She did not answer. She lay motionless, afraid that the slightest movement might make her vomit, but she felt an icy cold creeping from her feet to her heart. "Ah, it is beginning," she murmured. "What did you say?" She turned her head from side to side with a gentle movement full of agony, while constantly opening her mouth as if something very heavy were weighing upon her tongue. At 8 o'clock the vomiting began again. Charles noticed that at the bottom of the basin there was a sort of white sediment sticking to the sides of the porcelain. "This is extraordinary, very singular," he repeated. But she said in a firm voice, "No, you are mistaken." Then gently, and almost as caressing her, he passed his hand over her stomach. She uttered a sharp cry. He fell back, terror-stricken. Then she began to groan, faintly at first. Her shoulders were shaken by a strong shuddering, and she was growing paler than the sheets in which her clenched fingers buried themselves. Her unequal pulse was now almost imperceptible. Drops of sweat oozed from her bluish face, that seemed as if rigid in the exhalations of a metallic vapour. Her teeth chattered, her dilated eyes looked vaguely about her, and to all questions she replied only with a shake of the head. She even smiled once or twice. Gradually her moaning grew louder. A hollow shriek burst from her. She pretended she was better, and said she would get up presently. But she was seized with convulsions, and cried out, "Oh, my God, it is horrible!" He threw himself on his knees by her bed. "Tell me, what have you eaten? Answer, for heaven's sake!" And he looked at her with a tenderness in his eyes such as she had never seen. "Well, there," she said in a faint voice. He flew to the writing table, tore open the seal, and read aloud, "Accuse no one." He stopped, passed his hand across his eyes, and read it over again. "What? Help! Help!" He could only keep repeating the word, "Poisoned! Poisoned!" Félicité ran to Homais, who proclaimed it in the marketplace. Madame Lefrançois heard it at the Lion d'Or. Some got up to go and tell their neighbours, and all night the village was on the alert. Distraught, faltering, reeling, Charles wandered about the room. He knocked against the furniture, tore his hair, and the chemist never believed that there could be so terrible a sight. He went home to write to Monsieur Carnavay and to Dr. Larivière. He lost his head and made more than 15 rough copies. Hippolyte went to Neufchâtel, and Justin so spurred Bovary's horse that he left it foundered and 3 parts dead by the hill at Bois-Guillaume. Charles tried to look up his medical dictionary, but could not read it. The lines were dancing. "Be calm," said the druggist. "We have only to administer a powerful antidote. What is the poison?" Charles showed him the letter. It was arsenic. "Very well," said Homais. "We must make an analysis." For he knew that in cases of poisoning an analysis must be made, and the other, who did not understand, answered, "Oh, do anything, save her." Then going back to her, he sank upon the carpet and lay there with his head leaning against the edge of her bed, sobbing. "Don't cry," she said to him. "Soon I shall not trouble you any more." "Why was it? Who drove you to it?" She replied, "It had to be, my dear." "Weren't you happy? Is it my fault? I did all I could." "Yes, that is true. You are good, you." And she passed her hand slowly over his hair. The sweetness of this sensation deepened his sadness. He felt his whole being dissolving in despair at the thought that he must lose her, just when she was confessing more love for him than ever. And he could think of nothing. He did not know. He did not dare. The urgent need for some immediate resolution gave the finishing stroke to the turmoil of his mind. So she had done, she thought, with all the treachery and meanness and numberless desires that had tortured her. She hated no one now. A twilight dimness was settling upon her thoughts, and of all earthly noises Emma heard none but the intermittent lamentations of this poor heart, sweet and indistinct like the echo of a symphony dying away. "Bring me the child," she said, raising herself on her elbow. "You're not worse, are you?" asked Charles. "No, no." The child, serious and still half asleep, was carried in on the servant's arm in her long white nightgown from which her bare feet peeped out. She looked wonderingly at the disordered room and half closed her eyes, dazzled by the candles burning on the table. They reminded her, no doubt, of the morning of New Year's Day and mid-Lent, when thus awakened early by candlelight she came to her mother's bed to fetch her presents, for she began saying, "But where is it, mamma?" And as everybody was silent, "But I can't see my little stocking." Félicité held her over the bed while she still kept looking towards the mantelpiece. "Has nurse taken it?" she asked. And at this name that carried her back to the memory of her adulteries and her calamities, Madame Bovary turned away her head as at the loathing of another bitterer poison that rose to her mouth. But Bertha remained perched on the bed. "Oh, how big your eyes are, mamma! How pale you are! How hot you are!" Her mother looked at her. "I am frightened," cried the child, recoiling. Emma took her hand to kiss it. The child struggled. "That will do. Take her away," cried Charles, who was sobbing in the alcove. Then the symptoms ceased for a moment. She seemed less agitated, and at every insignificant word, at every respiration a little more easy, he regained hope. At last, when Canivet came in, he threw himself into his arms. "Ah, 'tis you. Thanks, you are good. But she is better. See, look at her." His colleague was by no means of this opinion, and, as he said to himself, never beating about the bush, he prescribed an emetic in order to empty the stomach completely. She soon began vomiting blood. Her lips became drawn. Her limbs were convulsed, her whole body covered with brown spots, and her pulse slipped beneath the fingers like a stretched thread, like a harp string nearly breaking. After this she began to scream horribly. She cursed the poison, railed at it, and implored it to be quick, and thrust away with her stiffened arms everything that Charles, in more agony than herself, tried to make her drink. He stood up, his handkerchief to his lips, with a rattling sound in his throat, weeping and choked by sobs that shook his whole body. Félicité was running hither and thither in the room. Homais, motionless, uttered great sighs, and Monsieur Canivet, always retaining his self-command, nevertheless began to feel uneasy. "The devil! She has been purged, and from the moment that the cause ceases." "The effect must cease," said Homais. "That is evident." "Oh, save her!" cried Bovary. And, without listening to the chemist, who was still venturing the hypothesis, "It is perhaps a salutary paroxysm," Canivet was about to administer some theriac when they heard the cracking of a whip. All the windows rattled, and a post-chaise drawn by 3 horses abreast, up to their ears in mud, drove at a gallop round the corner of the market. It was Dr. Lariviere. The apparition of a god would not have caused more commotion. Bovary raised his hands, Canivet stopped short, and Homais pulled off his skull-cap long before the doctor had come in. He belonged to that great school of surgery begotten of Bichat, to that generation now extinct of philosophical practitioners who, loving their art with a fanatical love, exercised it with enthusiasm and wisdom. Everyone in his hospital trembled when he was angry, and his students so revered him that they tried, as soon as they were themselves in practice, to imitate him as much as possible, so that in all the towns about they were found wearing his long wadded merino overcoat and black frock-coat, whose buttoned cuffs slightly covered his brawny hands, very beautiful hands, and that never knew gloves, as though to be more ready to plunge into suffering. Disdainful of honours, of titles, and of academies, like one of the old knight hospitaliers, generous, fatherly to the poor, and practising virtue without believing in it, he would almost have passed for a saint if the keenness of his intellect had not caused him to be feared as a demon. His glance, more penetrating than his bistouries, looked straight into your soul, and dissected every lie athwart all assertions and all reticences. And thus he went along, full of that debonair majesty that is given by the consciousness of great talent, of fortune, and of 40 years of a laborious and irreproachable life. He frowned as soon as he had passed the door, when he saw the cadaverous face of Emma stretched out on her back with her mouth open. Then, while apparently listening to Canivet, he rubbed his fingers up and down beneath his nostrils and repeated, "Good, good." But he made a slow gesture with his shoulders. Bovary watched him. They looked at one another. And this man, accustomed as he was to the sight of pain, could not keep back a tear that fell on his shirt-frill. He tried to take Canivet into the next room. Charles followed him. "She is very ill, isn't she? If we put on synapisms, anything, I'll think of something, you who have saved so many." Charles caught him in both his arms and gazed at him wildly, imploringly, half fainting against his breast. "Come, my poor fellow, courage. There is nothing more to be done." And Dr. Lariviere turned away. "You are going?" "I will come back." He went out only to give an order to the coachman with Monsieur Canivet, who did not care either to have Emma die under his hands. The chemist rejoined them on the Place. He could not by temperament keep away from celebrity, so he begged Monsieur Lariviere to do him the signal honour of accepting some breakfast. He sent quickly to the Lion d'Or for some pigeons, to the butcher's for all the cutlets that were to be had, to Tuvache for cream, and to Lestiboudois for eggs, and the druggist himself aided in the preparations, while Madame Homais was saying, as she pulled together the strings of her jacket, "You must excuse us, sir, for in this poor place, when one hasn't been told the night before—" "Wine-glasses," whispered Homais. "If only we were in town we could fall back upon stuffed trotters. Be quiet. Sit down, doctor." He thought fit, after the first few mouthfuls, to give some details as to the catastrophe. "We first had a feeling of cecity in the pharynx, then intolerable pains at the epigastrium, superpurgation, coma." "But how did she poison herself?" "I don't know, doctor, and I don't even know where she can have procured the arsenious acid." Justin, who was just bringing in a pile of plates, began to tremble. "What's the matter?" said the chemist. At this question the young man dropped the whole lot on the ground with a crash. "Imbecile!" cried Homais. "Awkward lout, blockhead, confounded ass!" But suddenly controlling himself, "I wished, doctor, to make an analysis, and primo I delicately introduced a tube—" "You would have done better," said the physician, "to introduce your fingers into her throat." His colleague was silent, having just before privately received a severe lecture about his emetic, so that this good Carnavay, so arrogant and so verbose at the time of the clubfoot, was today very modest. He smiled without ceasing in an approving manner. Homais dilated in amphitryon pride, and the affecting thought of Bovary vaguely contributed to his pleasure by a kind of egotistic reflex upon himself. Then the presence of the doctor transported him. He displayed his erudition, cited pell-mell cantharides, upas, the manchineel, vipers. I have even read that various persons have found themselves under toxicological symptoms and, as it were, thunder-stricken by black pudding that had been subjected to a too vehement fumigation. At least this was stated in a very fine report drawn up by one of our pharmaceutical chiefs, one of our masters, the illustrious Cadet de Gassicourt. Madame Homais reappeared, carrying one of those shaky machines that are heated with spirits of wine, for Homais liked to make his coffee at table, having moreover torrefied it, pulverized it, and mixed it himself. "Saccharum, doctor?" he said, offering the sugar. Then he had all his children brought down, anxious to have the physician's opinion on their constitutions. At last Monsieur Larivière was about to leave, when Madame Homais asked for a consultation about her husband. He was making his blood too thick by going to sleep every evening after dinner. "Oh, it isn't his blood that's too thick," said the physician. And smiling a little at his unnoticed joke, the doctor opened the door. But the chemist's shop was full of people. He had the greatest difficulty in getting rid of Monsieur Tuvache, who feared his spouse would get inflammation of the lungs because she was in the habit of spitting on the ashes, then of Monsieur Binet, who sometimes experienced sudden attacks of great hunger, and of Madame Caron, who suffered from tinglings, of Lheureux, who had vertigo, of Lestiboudois, who had rheumatism, and of Madame Lefrançois, who had heartburn. At last the three horses started, and it was the general opinion that he had not shown himself at all obliging. Public attention was distracted by the appearance of Monsieur Bournisien, who was going across the market with the holy oil. Homais, as was due to his principles, compared priests to ravens attracted by the odour of death. The sight of an ecclesiastic was personally disagreeable to him, for the cassock made him think of the shroud, and he detested the one from some fear of the other. Nevertheless, not shrinking from what he called his mission, he returned to Bovary's in company with Carnavay, whom Monsieur Larivière, before leaving, had strongly urged to make this visit, and he would, but for his wife's objections, have taken his two sons with him, in order to accustom them to great occasions, that this might be a lesson, for example, a solemn picture that should remain in their heads later on. The room when they went in was full of mournful solemnity. On the work-table, covered over with a white cloth, there were 5 or 6 small bowls of cotton in a silver dish, near a large crucifix between 2 lighted candles. Emma, her chin sunken upon her breast, had her eyes inordinately wide open, and her poor hands wandered over the sheets with that hideous and soft movement of the dying that seems as if they wanted already to cover themselves with the shroud. Pale as a statue, and with eyes red as fire, Charles, not weeping, stood opposite her at the foot of the bed, while the priest, bending one knee, was muttering words in a low voice. She turned her face slowly, and seemed filled with joy on seeing suddenly the violet stole, no doubt finding again, in the midst of a temporary lull in her pain, the lost voluptuousness of her first mystical transports, with the visions of eternal beatitude that were beginning. The priest rose to take the crucifix. Then she stretched forward her neck as one who is athirst, and gluing her lips to the body of the man-god, she pressed upon it with all her expiring strength the fullest kiss of love that she had ever given. Then he recited the Misereata and the Indulgentem, dipped his right thumb in the oil, and began to give extreme unction. First upon the eyes that had so coveted all worldly pomp, then upon the nostrils that had been greedy of the warm breeze and amorous odours, then upon the mouth that had uttered lies, that had curled with pride and cried out in lewdness, then upon the hands that had delighted in sensual touches, and finally upon the soles of the feet so swift of yore when she was running to satisfy her desires, and that would now walk no more. The curé wiped his fingers, threw the bit of cotton dipped in oil into the fire, and came and sat down by the dying woman, to tell her that she must now blend her sufferings with those of Jesus Christ, and abandon herself to the divine mercy. Finishing his exhortations, he tried to place in her hand a blessed candle, symbol of the celestial glory with which she was soon to be surrounded. Emma, too weak, could not close her fingers, and the taper, but for Monsieur Bournisien, would have fallen to the ground. However, she was not quite so pale, and her face had an expression of serenity, as if the sacrament had cured her. The priest did not fail to point this out. He even explained to Bovary that the Lord sometimes prolonged the life of persons when he thought it meet for their salvation, and Charles remembered the day when, so near death, she had received the communion. Perhaps there was no need to despair, he thought. In fact, she looked around her slowly, as one awakening from a dream. Then, in a distinct voice, she asked for her looking-glass, and remained some time bending over it, until the big tears fell from her eyes. Then she turned away her head with a sigh, and fell back upon the pillows. Her chest soon began panting rapidly. The whole of her tongue protruded from her mouth. Her eyes, as they rolled, grew paler, like the two globes of a lamp that is going out, so that one might have thought her already dead, but for the fearful labouring of her ribs, shaken by violent breathing, as if the soul was struggling to free itself. Félicité knelt down before the crucifix, and the druggist himself slightly bent his knees, while Monsieur Carnavay looked out vaguely at the Place. Bournisien had again begun to pray, his face bowed against the edge of the bed, his long black cassock trailing behind him in the room. Charles was on the other side, on his knees, his arms outstretched towards Emma. He had taken her hands and pressed them, shuddering at every beat of her heart, as at the shaking of a falling ruin. As the death rattle became stronger, the priest prayed faster. His prayers mingled with the stifled sobs of Bovary, and sometimes all seemed lost in the muffled murmur of the Latin syllables that tolled like a passing bell. Suddenly on the pavement was heard a loud noise of clogs and the clattering of a stick, and a voice rose, a raucous voice, that sang, "Maids in the warmth of a summer day, dream of love and of love always." Emma raised herself like a galvanized corpse, her hair undone, her eyes fixed, staring. "When the sickle blades have been, Nanette, gathering ears of corn, Vases bending down, my queen, to the earth where they were born." "The blind man!" she cried. And Emma began to laugh, an atrocious, frantic, despairing laugh, thinking she saw the hideous face of the poor wretch that stood out against the eternal night like a menace. "The wind is strong this summer day, her petticoat has flown away." She fell back upon the mattress in a convulsion. They all drew near. She was dead. End of Part 3, Chapter 8. Part 3, Chapter 9 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 9. There is always, after the death of anyone, a kind of stupefaction. So difficult is it to grasp this advent of nothingness, and to resign ourselves to believe in it. But still, when he saw that she did not move, Charles threw himself upon her, crying, "Farewell! Farewell!" Homais and Carnavay dragged him from the room. "Restrain yourself." "Yes," said he, struggling. "I'll be quiet. I'll not do anything, but leave me alone. I want to see her. She is my wife." And he wept. "Cry," said the chemist. "Let nature take her course. That will solace you." Weaker than a child, Charles let himself be led downstairs into the sitting-room, and Monsieur Homais soon went home. On the Place he was accosted by the blind man, who, having dragged himself as far as Yonville in the hope of getting the antiphlogistic pomade, was asking every passer-by where the druggist lived. "There now, as if I hadn't got other fish to fry. Well, so much the worse. You must come later on." And he entered the shop hurriedly. He had to write 2 letters, to prepare a soothing potion for Bovary, to invent some lie that would conceal the poisoning, and work it up into an article for the Fanal, without counting the people who were waiting to get the news from him. And when the Yonvillers had all heard his story of the arsenic that she had mistaken for sugar in making a vanilla cream, Homais once more returned to Bovary's. He found him alone. Monsieur Canivet had left, sitting in an armchair near the window, staring with an idiotic look at the flags of the floor. "Now," said the chemist, "you ought yourself to fix the hour for the ceremony." "Why, what ceremony?" Then, in a stammering, frightened voice, "Oh, no, not that. No, I want to see her here." Homais, to keep himself in countenance, took up a water-bottle on the whatnot to water the geraniums. "Ah, thanks," said Charles, "you are good." But he did not finish, choking beneath the crowd of memories that this action of the druggist recalled to him. Then, to distract him, Homais thought fit to talk a little horticulture. Plants wanted humidity. Charles bowed his head in sign of approbation. "Besides, the fine days will soon be here again." "Ah," said Bovary. The druggist, at his wit's end, began softly to draw aside the small window curtain. "Hallo, there's Monsieur Tuvache passing." Charles repeated, like a machine, "Monsieur Tuvache passing." Homais did not dare to speak to him again about the funeral arrangements. It was the priest who succeeded in reconciling him to them. He shut himself up in his consulting room, took a pen, and after sobbing for some time, wrote, "I wish her to be buried in her wedding dress with white shoes and a wreath. Her hair is to be spread out over her shoulders. 3 coffins, 1 of oak, 1 of mahogany, 1 of lead. Let no one say anything to me. I shall have strength. Over all there is to be placed a large piece of green velvet. This is my wish. See that it is done." The 2 men were much surprised at Bovary's romantic ideas. The chemist at once went to him and said, "This velvet seems to me a superfetation. Besides, the expense—" "What's that to you?" cried Charles. "Leave me. You did not love her. Go." The priest took him by the arm for a turn in the garden. He discoursed on the vanity of earthly things. God was very great, was very good. One must submit to his decree without a murmur, nay, must even thank him. Charles burst out into blasphemies. "I hate your God." "The spirit of rebellion is still upon you," sighed the ecclesiastic. Bovary was far away. He was walking with great strides along by the wall, near the espalier, and he ground his teeth. He raised to heavens looks of malediction, but not so much as a leaf stirred. A fine rain was falling. Charles, whose chest was bare, at last began to shiver. He went in and sat down in the kitchen. At 6 o'clock a noise like a clatter of old iron was heard on the Place. It was the Hirondelle coming in, and he remained with his forehead against the window-pane, watching all the passengers get out, one after the other. Félicité put down a mattress for him in the drawing-room. He threw himself upon it and fell asleep. Although a philosopher, Monsieur Homais respected the dead. So, bearing no grudge to poor Charles, he came back again in the evening to sit up with the body, bringing with him 3 volumes and a pocket-book for taking notes. Monsieur Bournisien was there, and 2 large candles were burning at the head of the bed that had been taken out of the alcove. The druggist, on whom the silence weighed, was not long before he began formulating some regrets about this unfortunate young woman, and the priest replied that there was nothing to do now but pray for her. Yet, Homais went on, one of two things. Either she died in a state of grace, as the Church has it, and then she has no need of our prayers, or else she departed impertinent. That is, I believe, the ecclesiastic expression, and then— Bournisien interrupted him, replying testily that it was none the less necessary to pray. But, objected the chemist, since God knows all our needs, what can be the good of prayer? What? Cried the ecclesiastic. Prayer? Why, aren't you a Christian? Excuse me, said Homais, I admire Christianity. To begin with, it enfranchised the slaves, introduced into the world a morality— That isn't the question. All the texts— Oh, as to texts, look at history. It is known that all the texts have been falsified by the Jesuits. Charles came in, and advancing towards the bed, slowly drew the curtains. Emma's head was turned towards her right shoulder. The corner of her mouth, which was open, seemed like a black hole at the lower part of her face. Her two thumbs were bent into the palms of her hands. A kind of white dust besprinkled her lashes, and her eyes were beginning to disappear in that viscous pallor that looks like a thin web, as if spiders had spun it over. The sheet sunk in from her breast to her knees, and then rose at the tips of her toes, and it seemed to Charles that infinite masses, an enormous load, were weighing upon her. The church clock struck 2. They could hear the loud murmur of the river flowing in the darkness at the foot of the terrace. Monsieur Bournisien from time to time blew his nose noisily, and Homais' pen was scratching over the paper. "Come, my good friend," he said, "withdraw. This spectacle is tearing you to pieces." Charles once gone, the chemist and the curé recommenced their discussions. "Read Voltaire," said the one. "Read D'Holbach. Read the Encyclopedia." "Read the letters of some Portuguese Jews," said the other. "Read The Meaning of Christianity by Nicholas, formerly a magistrate." They grew warm. They grew red. They both talked at once without listening to each other. Bournisien was scandalized at such audacity. Homais marvelled at such stupidity, and they were on the point of insulting one another when Charles suddenly reappeared. A fascination drew him. He was continually coming upstairs. He stood opposite her, the better to see her, and he lost himself in a contemplation so deep that it was no longer painful. He recalled stories of catalepsy, the marvels of magnetism, and he said to himself that by willing it with all his force he might perhaps succeed in reviving her. Once he even bent towards her and cried in a low voice, "Emma, Emma." His strong breathing made the flames of the candles tremble against the wall. At daybreak Madame Bovary senior arrived. Charles, as he embraced her, burst into another flood of tears. She tried, as the chemist had done, to make some remarks to him on the expenses of the funeral. He became so angry that she was silent, and he even commissioned her to go to town at once and buy what was necessary. Charles remained alone the whole afternoon. They had taken Berthe to Madame Homais. Félicité was in the room upstairs with Madame Lefrançois. In the evening he had some visitors. He rose, pressed their hands, unable to speak. Then they sat down near one another and formed a large semicircle in front of the fire. With lowered faces and swinging one leg crossed over the other knee, they uttered deep sighs at intervals. Each one was inordinately bored, and yet none would be the first to go. Homais, when he returned at 9 o'clock, for the last 2 days only Homais seemed to have been on the Place, was laden with a stock of camphor, of benzine, and aromatic herbs. He also carried a large jar full of chlorine water to keep off all miasmata. Just then the servant, Madame Lefrançois, and Madame Bovary senior were busy about Emma, finishing dressing her, and they were drawing down the long stiff veil that covered her to her satin shoes. Félicité was sobbing, "Ah, my poor mistress, my poor mistress." "Look at her," said the landlady, sighing. "How pretty she still is. Now couldn't you swear she was going to get up in a minute?" Then they bent over her to put on her wreath. They had to raise the head a little, and a rush of black liquid issued, as if she were vomiting, from her mouth. "Oh, goodness, the dress! Take care!" cried Madame Lefrancois. "Now, just come and help," she said to the chemist. "Perhaps you're afraid?" "Afraid?" replied he, shrugging his shoulders. "I dare say. I've seen all sorts of things at the hospital when I was studying pharmacy. We used to make punch in the dissecting room. Nothingness does not terrify a philosopher, and, as I often say, I even intend to leave my body to the hospitals in order, later on, to serve science." The curé, on his arrival, inquired how Monsieur Bovary was, and on the reply of the druggist went on, "The blow, you see, is still too recent." Then Homais congratulated him on not being exposed, like other people, to the loss of a beloved companion, whence there followed a discussion on the celibacy of priests. "For," said the chemist, "it is unnatural that a man should do without a woman. There have been crimes—" "But, good heavens!" cried the ecclesiastic, "how do you expect an individual who is married to keep the secrets of the confessional, for example?" Homais fell foul of the confessional. Bournisien defended it. He enlarged on the acts of restitution that it brought about. He cited various anecdotes about thieves who had suddenly become honest. Military men, on approaching the tribunal of penitence, had felt the scales fall from their eyes. At Viborg there was a minister. His companion was asleep. Then he felt somewhat stifled by the over-heavy atmosphere of the room. He opened the window. This awoke the chemist. "Come, take a pinch of snuff," he said to him. "Take it. It'll relieve you." A continual barking was heard in the distance. "Do you hear that dog howling?" said the chemist. "They smell the dead," replied the priest. "It's like bees. They leave their hives on the decease of any person." Homais made no remark upon these prejudices, for he had again dropped asleep. Monsieur Bournisien, stronger than he, went on moving his lips gently for some time. Then insensibly his chin sank down. He let fall his big black boot and began to snore. They sat opposite one another, with protruding stomachs, puffed-up faces, and frowning looks, after so much disagreement, uniting at last in the same human weakness. And they moved no more than the corpse by their side, that seemed to be sleeping. Charles, coming in, did not wake them. It was the last time. He came to bid her farewell. The aromatic herbs were still smoking, and spirals of bluish vapour blended at the window sash with the fog that was coming in. There were few stars, and the night was warm. The wax of the candles fell in great drops upon the sheets of the bed. Charles watched them burn, tiring his eyes against the glare of their yellow flame. The watering on the satin gown shimmered white as moonlight. Emma was lost beneath it, and it seemed to him that, spreading beyond her own self, she blended confusedly with everything around her, the silence, the night, the passing wind, the damp odours rising from the ground. Then suddenly he saw her in the garden at Toster's, on a bench against the thorn hedge, or else at Rouen in the streets, on the threshold of their house, in the yard at Bertaux. He again heard the laughter of the happy boys beneath the apple trees. The room was filled with the perfume of her hair, and her dress rustled in his arms with a noise like electricity. The dress was still the same. For a long while he thus recalled all his lost joys, her attitudes, her movements, the sound of her voice. Upon one fit of despair followed another, and even others, inexhaustible as the waves of an overflowing sea. A terrible curiosity seized him. Slowly, with the tips of his fingers palpitating, he lifted her veil. But he uttered a cry of horror that awoke the other two. They dragged him down into the sitting-room. Then Félicité came up to say that he wanted some of her hair. "Cut some off," replied the druggist. And as she did not dare to, he himself stepped forward, scissors in hand. He trembled so that he pierced the skin of the temple in several places. At last, stiffening himself against emotion, Homais gave 2 or 3 great cuts at random that left white patches amongst that beautiful black hair. The chemist and the curé plunged anew into their occupations, not without sleeping from time to time, of which they accused each other reciprocally at each fresh awakening. The Monsieur Bournisien sprinkled the room with holy water, and Homais threw a little chlorine water on the floor. Félicité had taken care to put on the chest of drawers for each of them a bottle of brandy, some cheese, and a large roll, and the druggist, who could not hold out any longer, about 4 in the morning, sighed, "My word, I should like to take some sustenance." The priest did not need any persuading. He went out to go and say mass, came back, and then they ate and hobnobbed, giggling a little, without knowing why, stimulated by that vague gaiety that comes upon us after times of sadness. And at the last glass the priest said to the druggist, as he clapped him on the shoulder, "We shall end by understanding one another." In the passage downstairs they met the undertaker's men, who were coming in. Then Charles for 2 hours had to suffer the torture of hearing the hammer resound against the wood. Next day they lowered her into her oak coffin that was fitted into the other 2, but as the bier was too large they had to fill up the gaps with the wool of a mattress. At last, when the 3 lids had been planed down, nailed, soldered, it was placed outside in front of the door. The house was thrown open, and the people of Yonville began to flock round. Old Rouault arrived and fainted on the place when he saw the black cloth. End of Part 3, Chapter 9. Part 3, Chapter 10 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 10. He had only received the chemist's letter 36 hours after the event, and from consideration of his feelings, Homais had so worded it that it was impossible to make out what it was all about. First the old fellow had fallen as if struck by apoplexy. Next he understood that she was not dead, but she might be. At last he had put on his blouse, taken his hat, fastened his spurs to his boots, and set out at full speed, and the whole of the way old Rouault, panting, was torn by anguish. Once even he was obliged to dismount. He was dizzy. He heard voices going round about him. He felt himself going mad. Day broke. He saw 3 black hens asleep in a tree. He shuddered, horrified at this omen. Then he promised the Holy Virgin 3 chasubles for the church, and that he would go barefooted from the cemetery at Bertaux to the chapel at Varsonville. He entered Maromme shouting for the people of the inn, burst open the door with a thrust of his shoulder, made for a sack of oats, emptied a bottle of sweet cider into the manger, and again mounted his nag, whose feet struck fire as it dashed along. He said to himself that no doubt they would save her. The doctors would discover some remedy, surely. He remembered all the miraculous cures he had been told about. Then she appeared to him, dead. She was there, before his eyes, lying on her back in the middle of the road. He reined up, and the hallucination disappeared. At Quincampoix, to give himself heart, he drank 3 cups of coffee, one after the other. He fancied they had made a mistake in the name in writing. He looked for the letter in his pocket, felt it there, but did not dare to open it. At last he began to think it was all a joke, someone's spite, the jest of some wag. And besides, if she were dead, one would have known it. But no, there was nothing extraordinary about the country. The sky was blue, the trees swayed, a flock of sheep passed. He saw the village. He was seen coming, bending forward upon his horse, belabouring it with great blows, the girths dripping with blood. When he had recovered consciousness, he fell, weeping, into Bovary's arms. "My girl, Emma, my child, tell me." The other replied, sobbing, I don't know, it's a curse." The druggist separated them. "These horrible details are useless. I will tell this gentleman all about it. Here are the people coming. Dignity! Come now, philosophy!" The poor fellow tried to show himself brave, and repeated several times, "Yes, courage." "Oh," cried the old man, "so I will have, by God. I'll go along to the end." The bell began tolling. All was ready. they had to start. And, seated in a stall of the choir, side by side, they saw pass and repass in front of them continually the 3 chanting choristers. The serpent player was blowing with all his might. Monsieur Bournisien, in full vestments, was singing in a shrill voice. He bowed before the tabernacle, raising his hands, stretched out his arms. Lestiboudois went about the church with his whalebone stick. The bier stood near the lectern, between 4 rows of candles. Charles felt inclined to get up and put them out. Yet he tried to stir himself into a feeling of devotion, to throw himself into the hope of a future life in which he should see her again. He imagined to himself she had gone on a long journey, far away, for a long time. But when he thought of her lying there, and that all was over, that they would lay her in the earth, he was seized with a fierce, gloomy, despairful rage. At times he thought he felt nothing more, and he enjoyed this lull in his pain, whilst at the same time he reproached himself for being a wretch. The sharp noise of an iron-ferruled stick was heard on the stones, striking them at irregular intervals. It came from the end of the church, and stopped short at the lower aisles. A man in a coarse brown jacket knelt down painfully. It was Hippolyte, the stable-boy at the lion door. He had put on his new leg. One of the choristers went round the nave, making a collection, and the coppers chinked one after the other on the silver plate. "Oh, make haste, I am in pain," cried Bovary, angrily throwing him a 5-franc piece. The churchman thanked him with a deep bow. They sang, they knelt, they stood up. It was endless. He remembered that once, in the early times, they had been to Mass together, and they had sat down on the other side, on the right, by the wall. The bell began again. There was a great moving of chairs. The bearers slipped their 3 staves under the coffin, and everyone left the church. Then Justin appeared at the door of the shop. He suddenly went in again, pale, staggering. People were at the windows to see the procession pass. Charles at the head walked erect. He affected a brave air, and saluted with a nod those who, coming out from the lanes or from their doors, stood amidst the crowd. The 6 men, 3 on either side, walked slowly, panting a little. The priests, the choristers, and the 2 choir boys recited the De Profundis, and their voices echoed over the fields, rising and falling with their undulations. Sometimes they disappeared in the windings of the path, but the great silver cross rose always before the trees. The women followed in black cloaks with turned-down hoods. Each of them carried in her hands a large lighted candle, and Charles felt himself growing weaker at this continual repetition of prayers and torches, beneath this oppressive odour of wax and of cassocks. A fresh breeze was blowing. The rye and colza were sprouting. Little dewdrops trembled at the roadsides and on the hawthorn hedges. All sorts of joyous sounds filled the air. The jolting of a cart rolling afar off in the ruts, the crowing of a cock repeated again and again, or the gambling of a foal running away under the apple trees. The pure sky was fretted with rosy clouds. A bluish haze rested upon the cots covered with iris. Charles, as he passed, recognized each courtyard. He remembered mornings like this, when, after visiting some patient, he came out from one and returned to her. The black cloth bestrewn with white beads blew up from time to time, laying bare the coffin. The tired bearers walked more slowly, and it advanced with constant jerks, like a boat that pitches with every wave. They reached the cemetery. The men went right down to a place in the grass where a grave was dug. They ranged themselves all round, and while the priest spoke, the red soil thrown up at the sides kept noiselessly slipping down at the corners. Then, when the 4 ropes were arranged, the coffin was placed upon them. He watched it descend. It seemed descending forever. At last a thud was heard. The ropes creaked as they were drawn up. Then Bournisien took the spade handed to him by Lestiboudois. With his left hand all the time sprinkling water, with the right he vigorously threw in a large spadeful, and the wood of the coffin, struck by the pebbles, gave forth that dread sound that seems to us the reverberation of eternity. The ecclesiastic passed the holy water sprinkler to his neighbour. This was Homais. He swung it gravely, then handed it to Charles, who sank to his knees in the earth and threw in handfuls of it, crying, "Adieu!" He sent her kisses. He dragged himself towards the grave to engulf himself with her. They led him away, and he soon grew calmer, feeling perhaps, like the others, a vague satisfaction that it was all over. Old Rouault, on his way back, began quietly smoking a pipe, which Homais, in his innermost conscience, thought not quite the thing. He also noticed that Monsieur Binet had not been present, and that Tuvache had made off after Mass, and that Théodore, the notary's servant, wore a blue coat, as if one could not have got a black coat, since that is the custom, by Jove. And to share his observations with others, he went from group to group. They were deploring Emma's death, especially Leroux, who had not failed to come to the funeral. Poor little woman, what a trouble for her husband. The druggist continued, "Do you know that but for me he would have committed some fatal attempt upon himself? Such a good woman, to think that I saw her only last Saturday in my shop. I haven't had leisure," said Homais, "to prepare a few words that I would have cast upon her tomb." Charles, on getting home, undressed, and old Rouault put on his blue blouse. It was a new one, and as he had often during the journey wiped his eyes on the sleeves, the dye had stained his face, and the traces of tears made lines in the layer of dust that covered it. Madame Bovary senior was with them. All three were silent. At last the old fellow sighed. "Do you remember, my friend, that I went to Tosta's once when you had just lost your first deceased? I consoled you at the time. I thought of something to say then, but now—" Then, with a loud groan that shook his whole chest, "Ah, this is the end for me, do you see? I saw my wife go, then my son, and now today it's my daughter." He wanted to go back at once to Berthaud, saying that he could not sleep in this house. He even refused to see his granddaughter. "No, no, it would grieve me too much. Only you'll kiss her many times for me. Good-bye. You're a good fellow." "And then I shall never forget that," he said, slapping his thigh. "Never fear, you shall always have your turkey." But when he reached the top of the hill he turned back, as he had turned once before on the road of Saint Victor when he had parted from her. The windows of the village were all on fire beneath the slanting rays of the sun sinking behind the field. He put his hand over his eyes, and saw in the horizon an enclosure of walls, where trees here and there formed black clusters between white stones. Then he went on his way at a gentle trot, for his nag had gone lame. Despite their fatigue, Charles and his mother stayed very long that evening, talking together. They spoke of the days of the past and of the future. She would come to live at Yonville. She would keep house for him. They would never part again. She was ingenious and caressing, rejoicing in her heart at gaining once more an affection that had wandered from her for so many years. Midnight struck. The village, as usual, was silent, and Charles, awake, thought always of her. Rodolphe, who, to distract himself, had been rambling about the wood all day, was sleeping quietly in his chateau, and Léon, down yonder, always slept. There was another who at that hour was not asleep. On the grave between the pine trees a child was on his knees weeping, and his heart, rent by sobs, was beating in the shadow beneath the load of an immense regret, sweeter than the moon and fathomless as the night. The gate suddenly grated. It was Lestiboudois. He came to fetch his spade that he had forgotten. He recognized Justin climbing over the wall, and at last knew who was the culprit who stole his potatoes. End of Part 3, Chapter 10. Part 3, Chapter 11 of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert, translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Peter Dan. Part 3, Chapter 11. The next day Charles had the child brought back. She asked for her mamma. They told her she was away, that she would bring her back some playthings. Bertha spoke of her again several times, then at last thought no more of her. The child's gaiety broke Bovary's heart, and he had to bear besides the intolerable consolations of the chemist. Money troubles soon began again, Monsieur Lheureux urging on anew his friend Vinçart, and Charles pledged himself for exorbitant sums, for he would never consent to let the smallest of the things that had belonged to her be sold. His mother was exasperated with him. He grew even more angry than she did. He had altogether changed. She left the house. Then everyone began taking advantage of him. Mademoiselle Lempereur presented a bill for 6 months' teaching, although Emma had never taken a lesson, despite the receipted bill she had shown Bovary. It was an arrangement between the two women. The man at the circulating library demanded 3 years' subscriptions. Mere Rollet claimed the postage due for some 20 letters, and when Charles asked for an explanation, she had the delicacy to reply, "Oh, I don't know, it was for her business affairs." With every debt he paid, Charles thought he had come to the end of them, but others followed ceaselessly. He sent in accounts for professional attendance. He was shown the letters his wife had written. Then he had to apologize. Félicité now wore Madame Bovary's gowns, not all, for he had kept some of them, and he went to look at them in her dressing-room, locking himself up there. She was about her height, and often Charles, seeing her from behind, was seized with an illusion and cried out, "Oh, stay, stay!" But at Whitsuntide she ran away from Yonville, carried off by Théodore, stealing all that was left of the wardrobe. It was about this time that the widow Dupuis had the honour to inform him of the marriage of Monsieur Léon Dupuis, her son, notary at Yvetot, to Mademoiselle Léosadie Leboeuf of Montville. Charles, among the other congratulations he sent him, wrote this sentence: "How glad my poor wife would have been." One day, when wandering aimlessly about the house, he had gone up to the attic. He felt a pellet of fine paper under his slippers. He opened it and read, "Courage, Emma, courage! I would not bring misery into your life." It was Rodolphe's letter, fallen to the ground between the boxes, where it had remained, and that the wind from the dormer window had just blown towards the door. And Charles stood motionless and staring in the very same place where, long ago, Emma, in despair, and paler even than he, had thought of dying. At last he discovered a small R at the bottom of the second page. What did this mean? He remembered Rodolphe's attentions, his sudden disappearance, his constrained air when they had met 2 or 3 times since. But the respectful tone of the letter deceived him. Perhaps they loved one another platonically, he said to himself. Besides, Charles was not of those who go to the bottom of things. He shrank from the proofs, and his vague jealousy was lost in the immensity of his woe. Everyone, he thought, must have adored her. All men assuredly must have coveted her. She seemed but the more beautiful to him for this. He was seized with a lasting, furious desire for her that inflamed his despair, and that was boundless, because it was now unrealizable. To please her, as if she was still living, he adopted her predilections, her ideas. He bought patent leather boots and took to wearing white cravats. He put cosmetics on his moustache and, like her, signed notes of hand. She corrupted him from beyond the grave. He was obliged to sell his silver piece by piece. Next he sold the drawing-room furniture. All the rooms were stripped, but the bedroom, her own room, remained as before. After his dinner, Charles went up there. He pushed the round table in front of the fire and drew up her armchair. He sat down opposite it. A candle burnt in one of the gilt candlesticks. Bertha, by his side, was painting prints. He suffered, poor man, at seeing her so badly dressed, with laceless boots, and the armholes of her pinafore torn down to the hips, for the charwoman took no care of her. But she was so sweet, so pretty, and her little head bent forward so gracefully, letting the dear fair hair fall over her rosy cheeks, that an infinite joy came upon him, a happiness mingled with bitterness, like those ill-made wines that taste of resin. He mended her toys, made her puppets from cardboard, or sewed up half-torn dolls. Then, if his eyes fell upon the work-box, a ribbon lying about, or even a pin left in a crack of the table, he began to dream and looked so sad that she became as sad as he. No one now came to see them, for Justin had run away to Rouen, where he was a grocer's assistant, and the druggist's children saw less and less of the child, Monsieur Homais not caring, seeing the difference of their social position, to continue the intimacy. The blind man, whom he had not been able to cure with the pomade, had gone back to the hill of Bois Guillaume, where he told the travellers of the vain attempt of the druggist, to such an extent that Homais, when he went to town, hid himself behind the curtains of the Hirondelle to avoid meeting him. He detested him, and wishing in the interest of his own reputation to get rid of him at all costs, he directed against him a secret battery that betrayed the depth of his intellect and the baseness of his vanity. Thus, for 6 consecutive months, one could read in the Fanal de Rouen editorials such as these: "All who bend their steps towards the fertile plains of Picardy have no doubt remarked by the Bois Guillaume hill a wretch suffering from a horrible facial wound. He importunes, persecutes one, and levies a regular tax on all travellers. Are we still living in the monstrous times of the Middle Ages, when vagabonds were permitted to display in our public places leprosy and scrofulas they had brought back from the Crusades? Or, in spite of the laws against vagabondage, the approaches to our great town continue to be infected by bands of beggars. Some are seen going about alone, and these are not perhaps the least dangerous. What are our ediles about?" Then Homais invented anecdotes. "Yesterday by the Bois Guillaume hill, a skittish horse," and then followed the story of an accident caused by the presence of the blind man. He managed so well that the fellow was locked up, but he was released. He began again, and Homais began again. It was a struggle. Homais won it, for his foe was condemned to lifelong confinement in an asylum. This success emboldened him, and henceforth there was no longer a dog run over, a barn burnt down, a woman beaten in the parish, of which he did not immediately inform the public, guided always by the love of progress and the hate of priests. He instituted comparisons between the elementary and clerical schools to the detriment of the latter, called to mind the massacre of St. Bartholomew apropos of a grant of 100 francs to the church, and denounced abuses, aired new views. That was his phrase. Homais was digging and delving. He was becoming dangerous. However, he was stifling in the narrow limits of journalism, and soon a book, a work, was necessary to him. Then he composed General Statistics of the Canon of Yonville, followed by climatological remarks. The statistics drove him to philosophy. He busied himself with great questions: the social problem, moralization of the poorer classes, pisciculture, caoutchouc, railways, etc. He even began to blush at being a bourgeois. He affected the artistic style. He smoked. He bought 2 chic Pompadour statuettes to adorn his drawing-room. He by no means gave up his shop. On the contrary, he kept well abreast of new discoveries. He followed the great movement of chocolates. He was the first to introduce cocoa and revalenta into the Seine inférieure. He was enthusiastic about the hydro-electric pulver-maché chains. He wore one himself, and when at night he took off his flannel vest, Madame Homais stood quite dazzled before the golden spirals beneath which he was hidden, and felt her ardour redouble for this man more bandaged than a Scythian, and splendid as one of the Magi. He had fine ideas about Emma's tomb. First he proposed a broken column with some drapery, next a pyramid, then a temple of Vesta, a sort of rotunda, or else a mass of ruins. And in all his plans Homais always stuck to the weeping willow, which he looked upon as the indispensable symbol of sorrow. Charles and he made a journey to Rouen together to look at some tombs at a funeral furnisher's, accompanied by an artist, one Vaufrylard, a friend of Brideau's, who made puns all the time. At last, after having examined some 100 designs, having ordered an estimate and made another journey to Rouen, Charles decided in favour of a mausoleum, which on the two principal sides was to have a spirit bearing an extinguished torch. As to the inscription, Homais could think of nothing so fine as Sta Viator, and he got no further. He racked his brain. He constantly repeated Sta Viator. At last he hit upon Amabilem conjugem calcus, which was adopted. A strange thing was that Bovary, while continually thinking of Emma, was forgetting her. He grew desperate as he felt this image fading from his memory, in spite of all efforts to retain it. Yet every night he dreamt of her. It was always the same dream. He drew near her, and when he was about to clasp her, she fell into decay in his wrists. For a week he was seen going to church in the evening. Monsieur Bourricien even paid him 2 or 3 visits, then gave him up. Moreover, the old fellow was growing intolerant, fanatic, said Homais. He thundered against the spirit of the age, and never failed every other week in his sermon to recount the death agony of Voltaire, who died devouring his excrements, as everyone knows. In spite of the economy with which Bovary lived, he was far from being able to pay off his old debts. Lheureux refused to renew any more bills. A distraint became imminent. Then he appealed to his mother, who consented to let him take a mortgage on her property, but with a great many recriminations against Emma. And in return for her sacrifice she asked for a shawl that had escaped the depredations of Félicité. Charles refused to give it her. They quarrelled. She made the first overtures of reconciliation by offering to have the little girl, who could help her in the house, to live with her. Charles consented to this, but when the time for parting came, all his courage failed him. Then there was a final, complete rupture. As his affections vanished, he clung more closely to the love of his child. She made him anxious, however, for she coughed sometimes and had red spots on her cheeks. Opposite his house, flourishing and merry, was the family of the chemist, with whom everything was prospering. Napoleon helped him in the laboratory. Athalie embroidered him a skull-cap. Irma cut out rounds of paper to cover the preserves, and Franklin recited Pythagoras' table in a breath. He was the happiest of fathers, the most fortunate of men. Not so. A secret ambition devoured him. Homais hankered after the cross of the Legion of Honour. He had plenty of claims to it. First, having at the time of the cholera distinguished myself by a boundless devotion. Second, by having published, at my expense, various works of public utility, such as, and he recalled his pamphlet entitled Cider, its Manufacture and Effects, besides observation of the lanigerous plant louse sent to the Academy, his volume of statistics, and down to his pharmaceutical thesis, without counting that I am a member of several learned societies. He was a member of a single one. In short, he cried, making a pirouette, if it were only for distinguishing myself at fires. Then Homais inclined towards the government. He secretly did the prefect great service during the elections. He sold himself, in a word, prostituted himself. He even addressed a petition to the sovereign in which he implored him to do him justice. He called him our good king and compared him to Henry IV. And every morning the druggist rushed for the paper to see if his nomination were in it. It was never there. At last, unable to bear it any longer, he had a grass plot in his garden designed to represent the Star of the Cross of Honour, with 2 little strips of grass running from the top to imitate the riband. He walked round it with folded arms, meditating on the folly of the government and the ingratitude of men. From respect, or from a sort of sensuality that made him carry on his investigations slowly, Charles had not yet opened the secret drawer of a rosewood desk which Emma had generally used. One day, however, he sat down before it, turned the key, and pressed the spring. All Léon's letters were there. There could be no doubt this time. He devoured them to the very last, ransacked every corner, all the furniture, all the drawers, behind the wall, sobbing, crying aloud, distraught, mad. He found a box and broke it open with a kick. Rodolphe's portrait flew full in his face in the midst of the overturned love letters. People wondered at his despondency. He never went out, saw no one, refused even to visit his patients. Then they said he shut himself up to drink. Sometimes, however, some curious person climbed onto the garden hedge and saw with amazement this long-bearded, shabbily clothed, wild man who wept aloud as he walked up and down. In the evening in summer he took his little girl with him and led her to the cemetery. They came back at nightfall, when the only light left in the Place was that in Binet's window. The voluptuousness of his grief was, however, incomplete, for he had no one near him to share it, and he paid visits to Madame Lefrancois to be able to speak of her. But the landlady only listened with half an ear, having troubles like himself. For Leroux had at last established the favorites du commerce, and Hivert, who enjoyed a great reputation for doing errands, insisted on a rise of wages, and was threatening to go over to the opposition shop. One day, when he had gone to the market at Aiguille to sell his horse, his last resource, he met Rodolphe. They both turned pale when they caught sight of one another. Rodolphe, who had only sent his card, first stammered some apologies, then grew bolder, and even pushed his assurance, it was in the month of August and very hot, to the length of inviting him to have a bottle of beer at the public-house. Leaning on the table opposite him, he chewed his cigar as he talked, and Charles was lost in reverie at this face that she had loved. He seemed to see again something of her in it. It was a marvel to him. He would have liked to have been this man. The other went on talking agriculture, cattle, pasturage, filling out with banal phrases all the gaps where an allusion might slip in. Charles was not listening to him. Rodolphe noticed it, and he followed the succession of memories that crossed his face. This gradually grew redder. The nostrils throbbed fast, the lips quivered. There was at last a moment when Charles, full of a sombre fury, fixed his eyes on Rodolphe, who, in something of fear, stopped talking. But soon the same look of weary lassitude came back to his face. "I don't blame you," he said. Rodolphe was dumb, and Charles, his head in his hands, went on in a broken voice and with a resigned accent of infinite sorrow. "No, I don't blame you now." He even made a fine phrase, the only one he ever made. "It is the fault of fatality." Rodolphe, who had managed the fatality, thought the remark very offhand from a man in his position, comic even, and a little mean. The next day Charles went to sit down on the seat in the arbour. Rays of light were straying through the trellis. The vine leaves threw their shadows on the sand. The jasmines perfumed the air. The heavens were blue, Spanish flies buzzed round the lilies in bloom, and Charles was suffocating like a youth beneath the vague love influences that filled his aching heart. At 7 o'clock little Bertha, who had not seen him all the afternoon, went to fetch him to dinner. His head was thrown back against the wall, his eyes closed, his mouth open, and in his hand was a long tress of black hair. "Come along, Papa," she said. And thinking he wanted to play, she pushed him gently. He fell to the ground. He was dead. 36 hours after, at the druggist's request, Monsieur Canivet came thither. He made a post-mortem and found nothing. When everything had been sold, 12 francs 75 centimes remained, that served to pay for Mademoiselle Bovary's going to her grandmother. The good woman died the same year. Old Rouault was paralysed, and it was an aunt who took charge of her. She is poor, and sends her to a cotton factory to earn a living. Since Bovary's death, 3 doctors have followed one another at Yonville without any success, so severely did Homais attack them. He has an enormous practice. The authorities treat him with consideration, and public opinion protects him. He has just received the Cross of the Legion of Honour. End of Madame Bovary by Gustave Flaubert. Translated by Eleanor Marks Aveling.